The tribunal hall stretched out before Tay like the inside of some massive creature. All curved walls and strange organic architecture that made him feel like he had been swallowed whole by something ancient and hungry. The ceiling rose so high above his head that it disappeared into shadow, and the walls were lined with hundreds of seats, ranged in circular tiers that climbed upward like the rings of a tree. Each seat was occupied by an alien being, and each alien being was staring down at him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to disgust to something that looked almost like fear. Tay stood on a small platform in the center of the chamber, bathed in a cold blue light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He was not a tall man, standing just under average height with a compact build that spoke of efficiency rather than intimidation. His black hair was longer than he usually kept it, grown shaggy during the weeks he had spent in a holding cell waiting for this moment. His simple gray prisoner uniform was wrinkled and stained, but he stood with his shoulders back and his hands clasped behind him in the posture that his military instructors had drilled into him. Years ago, the chamber was filled with sounds that he did not recognize. Clicks and whistles and low rumbling tones that the translation device implanted behind his ears struggled to interpret. Some of the aliens were speaking to each other in hushed voices, their strange mouths forming words that TA could not read. Others were simply watching him with the intensity of scientists observing a specimen under glass. He had felt this sensation before, this sense of being examined and measured and found wanting, but never on this scale, never surrounded by so many beings who saw him as something less than themselves. Arbiter Quillos sat on an elevated throne at the front of the chamber, raised above all the other council members on a platform that seemed designed to emphasize his authority and importance. He was a Velith, one of the insectoid species that dominated this sector of the galaxy, and his body was thin and angular, with an exoskeleton that gleamed like polished bronze in the blue light. Multiple arms extended from his torso, and they moved constantly as he spoke, gesturing and pointing and tapping against the armrests of his throne in patterns that seemed to carry meaning. His compound eyes were fixed on Tay, with an intensity that made the human feel like prey being sized up by a predator. Human designation Tay of Earth, Quillos announced, and his voice was high and grating. Like metal scraping against metal, it echoed through the chamber with a weight of authority that made several of the other aliens shrink back in their seats. You have been brought before this tribunal to answer for your crimes against the Galactic Commerce Accords. You are charged with the illegal transportation and distribution of banned substances across 17 sectors of regulated space. Tay listened to the words and felt a strange calm settle over him. Had known this moment was coming ever since the security forces had boarded his ship and torn apart his cargo hold looking for contraband. He had known that there would be consequences, that the galaxy did not forgive those who broke its laws. But standing here now, surrounded by beings who had already decided his guilt, he found that he was not afraid. He was tired and frustrated and more than a little annoyed. But fear was not among the emotions churning in his chest. It was chili flakes, he said, and his voice carried clearly through the chamber despite its softness. The translation device would convert his words into something the aliens could understand, but the tone would remain his own. Calm and unbothered and faintly amused, they were chili flakes for cooking. A murmur rippled through the crowd, the sound of hundreds of alien voices reacting to his words with surprise and confusion. Quillos slammed one of his many arms against the armrest of his throne, and the sharp crack echoed through the chamber like a gunshot silence. The word cut through the noise and the chamber fell still. Every eye turning back toward the confrontation at its center, Quillos leaned forward on his throne, his compound eyes gleaming with what might have been anticipation or anger, or both. The substance known as Gochugaru is classified as a Class 3 irritant and potential biological weapon under Section 4 of the Interstellar Trade Regulations. You were found with 12 containers of this dangerous material hidden in your cargo hold. Tay thought about this for a moment, letting the silence stretch while he considered his response. He thought about his grandmother, a small woman with strong hands who had spent her entire life in the kitchen of the family restaurant in Seoul. She had given him those chili flakes before he left Earth, packing them carefully into sealed containers and pressing them into his hands with tears in her eyes. She had told him that no matter how far he traveled, no matter what strange worlds he visited or alien beings he encountered, he should never forget the taste of home. She had told him that food was memory, that the dishes they shared connected them to their ancestors and to each other, even across the vast distances of space. He thought about the meals he had made in the small kitchen of his cargo ship. During the long months between planets, the smell of kimchi jjigae filling the corridors, driving away the cold sterility of recycled air and metal walls that tasted properly, seasoned meat after weeks of nutrient, paste and protein bars, the simple pleasure of sitting down to a meal that he had prepared with his own hands, using ingredients that carried the weight of generations. They were for personal use, he said finally, meeting Quellus's compound eyes without flinching. I like spicy food. Quellos made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been an expression of contempt, a harsh clicking that came from somewhere deep in his throat. The tribunal does not care about your personal preferences. Human, your species has been a member of the galactic community for only 47 years, and in that time, you have proven to be reckless and dangerous, and utterly without respect for the laws that govern civilized beings. Tay did not respond to this accusation. He had heard similar things many times since humans had first made contact with alien life. Since that day, when ships from another world had appeared in Earth's sky, and everything had changed forever, the galaxy, it seemed, was not prepared for a species that had evolved on a planet where everything from the weather to the wildlife seemed designed to kill them. Earth was classified as a Class 7 world in the galactic database, which meant it was considered moderately dangerous by the standards that govern such things. Most of the spacefaring species had evolved on Class 2 or 3 worlds, planets where the climate was stable and the predators were few and the greatest. Challenge to survival was boredom. The idea of a world with active volcanoes and shifting tectonic plates and weather systems that could level cities was almost incomprehensible to them. And the idea of eating something that could burn your mouth was absolutely terrifying. The evidence against you is overwhelming, Quillos continued, and he gestured to a screen that materialized in the air, showing footage of T being arrested on a space station. Armored security forces surrounded his ship while others dragged crates from his cargo hold, their scanning devices beeping warnings as they detected the banned substances inside. His cargo hold was full of the restricted material, and he made no attempt to hide his guilt or deny his actions. When confronted, I already said they were chili flakes, Tay repeated, and there was a note of irritation creeping into his voice now. I was not trying to hurt anyone. I was trying to make dinner. Another murmur went through the crowd, and Tay noticed that some of the aliens were leaning forward in their seats, watching him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. He realized that many of them had probably never seen a human before in person. The galactic community was vast, spanning thousands of worlds and hundreds of species, and humans were still relatively new to the scene. Most species only knew about Earth from reports and warnings and the occasional news story about some human doing something that the rest of the galaxy found either terrifying or inexplicable. Human climbing a mountain just to see what was at the top, a human eating a pepper that made their eyes water and their nose run, and then asking for another one, a human jumping out of a perfectly functional aircraft with nothing but a sheet of fabric to slow their fall. These stories circulated through the galactic networks like legends, cautionary tales about the strange and dangerous creatures that had somehow emerged from a world that should have killed them. Quillos raised one of his arms for silence, and the chamber fell still once more. The tribunal has reviewed your case thoroughly, and we have reached a decision regarding your punishment. He paused for effect, his compound eyes gleaming with satisfaction under normal circumstances. The penalty for your crimes would be 20 years of labor in the mining colonies of the Outer Rim. Tay felt his stomach tighten slightly at these words. The mining colonies were known throughout the galaxy as places where prisoners were sent to die slowly, ground down by exhaustion and radiation exposure until there was nothing left. He had heard stories from other haulers about ships that had passed too close to those asteroids and picked up distress signals that were decades old. Ghosts crying out into the void for help that would never come, however, Quillos continued. And there was something in his voice that made Tay tense. A note of cruel anticipation that suggested the worst was yet to come. The tribunal has decided to show mercy. This was not what Tay had expected. And he looked up at the High Arbiter with suspicion clear in his eyes and his experience. Mercy from beings like Quillos usually came with conditions that were far worse than the original punishment. Mercy was a word that powerful creatures used when they wanted to seem generous while still getting exactly what they wanted. You will be exiled, Quillos announced, and his voice rang through the chamber like a death sentence. You will be transported to the planet designated Zyrith 7 and left there to live out the remainder of your days. The reaction in the tribunal hall was immediate and overwhelming. Several aliens gasped, their strange mouths opening wide in expressions of shock and horror. Others made sounds of disbelief, clicking and whistling and rumbling in their various languages. Even the guards standing near Tay seemed to shift uncomfortably, and one of them actually took a step backward as if the mere mention of that planet was enough to cause harm. Tay had never heard of Zyrith 7, but based on the reactions around him, he understood that this was very bad news. Indeed, the planet is classified as a Class 9 world, Quillos explained, and there was a cruel smile in his voice, even if his face was not capable of making such an expression. It is one of only 3 such worlds in the known galaxy. The atmosphere is toxic to most forms of life. The native fauna are among the most dangerous predators ever. Documented the temperature shifts between extreme heat and extreme cold with no warning, sometimes within the span of a single hour. No observation drone has ever survived more than 72 hours on the surface. TE absorbed this information slowly, processing each detail and filing it away in his mind. He thought about the galactic classification system and what it meant in practical terms. A Class 9 world was considered essentially unsurvivable, a place so hostile that even visiting it was considered suicide. The fact that Earth was only a Class 7 suddenly seemed almost laughable. A minor inconvenience compared to what awaited him. You will be given a standard survival kit and one personal item of your choosing, Quillos said, his voice dripping with false generosity. You will be dropped on the surface and left there. The tribunal considers this a merciful alternative to the mining colonies, as it will allow you to die with some small measure of dignity. Tay was quiet for a long moment, and the entire hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his reaction. They expected fear or anger or despair. They expected him to fall to his knees and beg for a different sentence, to plead for his life, to show them the weakness that they assumed all humans possessed beneath their strange and disturbing exterior. They expected him to act the way any reasonable being would act when faced with certain death. Does the planet have running water? Tay asked the question was so unexpected that Quillos actually paused, his multiple arms freezing in mid-gesture as he processed what he had just heard. What? Running water? Tay repeated, his voice calm and curious. Is there water on the planet? Lakes or rivers or streams? Quillos seemed genuinely confused by this line of questioning, his compound eyes blinking in a way that suggested he was trying to figure out if the human had somehow misunderstood the situation. There are reports of bodies of water. Yes, the liquid is not pure, but it exists. Why do you ask? Tay nodded slowly, as if this was important information, as if he were evaluating the planet the way a tourist might evaluate a potential vacation destination. And wildlife, you said? There are predators, so there are animals that can be hunted? The tribunal hall was completely silent now, and everyone was staring at Tay with expressions that ranged from confusion to disbelief to something that might have been the beginning of fear. This was not how condemned prisoners behaved. This was not how any rational being behaved when faced with exile to a death world. Quillos recovered his composure with visible effort, his exoskeleton clicking as he shifted on his throne. The wildlife of Zyrith 7 is not prey. Human, they are predators, apex predators. Every creature on that world is designed to kill. That means they have meat.
Ow.
Tay said simply, and his voice was utterly calm. Meat can be cooked for a long moment. No one spoke. And then Quillos made that strange, laughing, clicking sound again. A harsh noise that echoed through the chamber. You humans truly are insane. Very well, take your delusions of survival with you to your grave. The tribunal has spoken. You will be transported immediately. The guards moved forward to take Tay by the arms, but he held up one hand, and they hesitated, waiting to see what he would do. Wait, he said. You said I could bring one personal item. Quillos waved dismissively with one of his many arms. Yes, one item. What do you want? Your primitive communication device? Some weapon that you think will save you? Tay reached into the pocket of his uniform and pulled out a small, worn notebook. The cover was faded and soft from years of handling, and the pages were yellow with age. There were stains on some of the pages from spilled ingredients, and the binding was held together in places with tape and hope. My grandmother's recipe book, Tay said, and he held it carefully, like it was the most valuable thing in the universe. Quillo stared at him for a long moment, his compound eyes unreadable. Then he shook his head in what appeared to be disgust, or perhaps bewilderment. Take him away. Let him cook his way to death if that is what he wishes. The guards grabbed Tay's arms and began to lead him out of the tribunal hall, but he did not resist. He walked calmly between them, his grandmother's notebook clutched against his chest as he walked. He looked around at the hundreds of alien faces watching him, and he saw fear in many of their eyes. They were afraid of him. He realized not because he was dangerous or violent, but because he was not afraid, because he had looked at their worst punishment and asked about water and wildlife and whether he could bring a cookbook, because he had treated a death sentence like a logistics problem to be solved rather than a fate to be mourned. As he was led through the corridors toward the transport ship, Tay opened the notebook and flipped through the pages. He saw his grandmother's handwriting, small and precise, filling page after page with recipes that had been passed down through generations of his family. He saw notes in the margins about which ingredients could be substituted when the original was unavailable, about which techniques worked best for different situations, about how to make a meal feel like home even when you were far away from everything. You knew. He thought about Zereth 7 and its toxic atmosphere and its deadly predators and its extreme temperatures. He thought about the fact that no one had ever survived there, that the aliens expected him to die within days, that the entire galaxy considered him already dead. Then he thought about Earth, about the volcanic eruptions that had shaped the landscape of his ancestors' homeland, about the earthquakes that had leveled cities and killed millions, about the hurricanes and typhoons and tsunamis that swept across the planet with devastating regularity, about the predators that humans had faced for hundreds of thousands of years, the tigers and bears and wolves and sharks that had hunted them in the darkness. He thought about the first humans who had discovered fire and learned to cook their food, transforming raw meat into something nourishing and delicious. He thought about the first humans who had tasted something spicy and instead of running away had decided to put it in their food on purpose. He thought about all the generations of his family who had survived war and famine and disaster by being stubborn and adaptable and refusing to give up. The transport ship was waiting at the end of the corridor, its hull gleaming under the artificial lights of the station. The guards pushed him toward the boarding ramp, and Tay went willingly, climbing the metal steps without looking back as he entered the ship. He was already planning, his mind working through the challenges ahead. He would need to analyze the atmosphere and find a way to filter out the toxins. He would need to identify which creatures were dangerous and which might be edible. He would need to find water and purify it, find shelter and reinforce it, find fuel and store it. He would need to do 1,000 things that no one had ever done on that planet, things that the aliens believed were impossible. And then, once he had established the basics of survival, he would need to figure out if anything on Zereth 7 tasted like pork belly. The ship lifted off from the station, and Tay watched through a small window as the massive structure grew smaller and smaller behind him. Somewhere on that station, Quillos was probably already composing his obituary. already celebrating the elimination of another troublesome human, already congratulating himself on his clever mercy. Tay smiled slightly and turned back to his grandmother's notebook. The pages were soft under his fingers, worn smooth by years of use in kitchens across Earth and across the stars. He found the recipe for kimchi jjigae and read through the ingredients slowly, mouthing the words to himself like a prayer. Pork belly, kimchi, tofu, gochugaru, garlic, onion, green onion. He would find substitutes. He would adapt. He would survive, and somehow, some way, he would make his grandmother proud. The ship entered faster than light travel, and the stars outside the window stretched into lines of light before disappearing entirely. Tay settled into his seat and continued reading, memorizing recipes and techniques in the small notes his grandmother had left in the margins. He had worked to do the drop pod hit the atmosphere of Zert-7 like a meteor, trailing fire and smoke as it plunged through layers of toxic cloud cover that swirled in colors Tay had never seen before. Oranges and purples and sickly greens that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The hull of the pod screamed around him, metal groaning under stresses it was barely designed to handle. And the heat shields on the exterior flared bright enough to turn the small viewport into a window of pure white light. Tay gripped the armrests of his seat and focused on his breathing, slow and steady, the way his instructors had taught him during survival training years ago. Panic would not help him now. Fear would not help him. The only things that would help were preparation and adaptation and the stubborn refusal to die that had carried his species through millions of years of evolution on a planet that had tried its best to kill them. The pod shook violently as it encountered some kind of atmospheric disturbance, and Tay felt his teeth rattle in his skull. Warning lights flashed across the control panel, red and yellow indicators screaming about hull integrity and temperature levels and a dozen other things that the automated systems considered dangerous. The pod had not been designed for comfort or even safety. He realized it had been designed to deliver a prisoner to a planet. Nothing more. The Velith did not expect their exiles to survive the landing, let alone what came after through the viewport. Tay caught glimpses of the world rushing up to meet him. The surface was a patchwork of dark greens and browns and grays, covered in vegetation so thick that it looked like a carpet from this height. Massive clouds of steam or smoke rose from various points across the landscape, suggesting volcanic activity or thermal vents or something else entirely. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating mountain ranges and valleys and what appeared to be vast bodies of liquid that gleamed with an oily sheen. Pod's retrorockets fired at the last possible moment, and Tay was slammed back into his seat as the vessel decelerated with brutal efficiency. The ground came up fast, too fast. And then there was an impact that rattled every bone in his body and made the world go dark for a moment. When he opened his eyes again, everything was still. Tay sat in the darkness of the pod, listening to the sounds of metal cooling and settling around him. His body ached from the impact, and when he moved experimentally, he could feel bruises forming on his arms and legs where the restraints had dug into his flesh, but nothing seemed to be broken. Nothing seemed to be damaged beyond repair. He was alive, which was more than the Velith had expected. He unstrapped himself from the seat and moved carefully to the hatch. His feet finding purchase on the tilted floor of the pod, the emergency release mechanism was still functional, glowing faintly in the darkness, and when he pulled the lever, the door blew outward with a hiss of compressed air and a rush of heat that made him stumble backward. The first thing that hit him was the smell. It was thick and heavy and complex, carrying layers of sensation that his brain struggled to process. There was sulfur, sharp and acrid, the kind of smell you got near volcanic hot springs or geothermal vents. There was something organic underneath that, rich and rotting, like vegetation decomposing in a swamp, and there was a metallic temps that coated the back of his throat. A taste as much as a smell that reminded him of blood or rust or both. The air was warm and humid, pressing against his skin like a wet blanket, and when Tay took his first breath, he understood immediately why the atmosphere was classified as toxic. His lungs burned with a sensation that was not quite pain, but definitely not comfortable, and his eyes watered as the chemicals in the air reacted with the moisture on their surface. There was a bitter taste on his tongue, something sharp and unpleasant that made him want to spit. He pulled back into the pod and covered his mouth and nose with his sleeve, his mind already working through the problem and searching for solutions on Earth. There were places where volcanic activity created similar atmospheric conditions. Hot springs and geothermal vents that released gases capable of making you sick if you breathed them for too long. The key to surviving in those environments was filtration. Finding ways to clean the air before it entered your lungs. The survival kit that the tribunal had provided was basic. Almost insultingly so, there was a small knife with a blade that was barely longer than his finger and so dull it could hardly cut bread. There was a container of water purification tablets, maybe enough for a week if he rationed them. Carefully, there was a thin, emergency blanket made of some kind of reflective material that would do almost nothing against real cold or heat, and there was a handful of nutrient bars that looked like they had been designed for a species that did not have teeth. Soft and gelatinous and completely unappetizing, Ta ignored most of the kit and focused on the blanket. He used the knife to cut a strip from the material, working slowly because the dull blade made even this simple task difficult. Then he found the pod's emergency water supply, a small container built into the wall, and wet the strip of fabric thoroughly. Finally, he tied the wet cloth around his face, covering his nose and mouth, and creating a basic filter that would trap at least some of the particles and toxins in the air. It was not a perfect solution, and he knew it would not protect him forever, but it would buy him time. And time was the most valuable resource he had right now. Tay stepped out of the pod and looked around at the world that was supposed to be his grave. The jungle was massive, stretching out in every direction as far as he could see. The trees, if they could be called trees, rose hundreds of feet into the air, their trunks as wide as buildings and covered in something that looked like scales or armor plates. Their bark was dark, almost black, and it had a texture that reminded him of reptile skin. The leaves were thick and waxy, ranging in color from deep purple to sickly yellow, and many of them seemed to be moving, even though there was no wind. The ground beneath his feet was soft and spongy, covered with a thick layer of decomposing plant matter that squelched with every step he took. The smell was stronger here, that mix of sulfur and rot and metal, and he could see insects buzzing around patches of fungus that glowed with bioluminescent light. Strange plants grew everywhere, some with flowers that pulsed with color, and others with tendrils that reached toward him as he passed. Sensing his movement or his body heat or something else entirely, the survival implant in his arm, a small device that had been installed when he first started working as a cargo hauler, began beeping frantically. The screen lit up with a cascade of warnings, each one more alarming than the last. Atmospheric toxicity at critical levels, extreme temperature variance detected, multiple hostile life forms detected in proximity, elevated radiation levels in surrounding area recommended. Action is immediate evacuation from current location. Looked at the implant and its parade of warnings, and then he pressed the button to mute the audio. The warnings continued to scroll across the screen, a constant reminder of how dangerous his situation was. But at least now, he could think without the incessant beeping. Spent the next hour exploring the immediate area around the crash site, moving carefully and keeping his senses alert. The jungle was alive with sounds, strange calls and clicks and rumbles that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He saw movement in the shadows between the trees, quick flashes of motion that suggested creatures watching him from concealment. But whatever was out there seemed content to observe rather than attack. The first creature he encountered directly emerged from the undergrowth with startling speed, appearing so suddenly that Tay barely had time to register its presence before it was in front of him. The thing was about the size of a large dog, maybe 30 or 40 kilograms, with 6 legs that ended in sharp claws and a body covered in plates of natural armor. Its head was mostly mouth, a gaping maw filled with rows of teeth that looked like they could crush bone without any effort at all. He froze, and the creature froze as well. They stared at each other for a long moment. Predator and prey, or perhaps two predators sizing each other up. Tay could see intelligence in the creature's eyes, a calculating awareness that was evaluating him. Deciding whether he was food or threat or something else entirely slowly, Tay reached for the knife at his belt. The creature tracked the movement with its eyes, but it did not attack, not yet. In his years of survival training, Tay had learned that predators operated on a simple calculation that governed all their behavior, risk versus reward. If the potential meal seemed dangerous or difficult to kill, the predator would usually back off and look for easier prey. The trick was convincing the predator that you were not worth the trouble, that attacking you would cost more than it would gain. Tay did not run. He did not show fear. He simply stood there with his hand on his knife and met the creature's gaze with steady calm. Projecting confidence and danger with every line of his body, after what felt like an eternity, the creature made a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a bark, a noise of frustration or uncertainty. Then it turned and disappeared back into the undergrowth, its armored body crashing through the vegetation as it retreated. He let out a breath he had not realized he was holding that was close. And he had been lucky that the creature had decided he was not worth the risk, but he had also learned something important. The creatures here were intelligent enough to assess threats, which meant they could be predicted, and anything that could be predicted could be dealt with. He continued his exploration, moving in wider circles around the crash site and building a mental map of the terrain. He found a small clearing near a rock formation that offered some natural shelter, a space where he could put his back against solid stone and see anything approaching from the front. The rocks were warm to the touch, which suggested geothermal activity beneath the surface that could be useful in many ways. Heat meant the ability to stay warm during the cold periods that the tribunal had mentioned. It might also mean hot water, which meant cooking and cleaning and a dozen other things that would make survival easier. They began to set up camp, working with the efficiency of long practice, gathered fallen branches and large leaves to create a basic shelter against the rocks, weaving them together to form walls and a roof that would keep out rain and wind. Found stones that could be arranged to create a fire pit, flat pieces of rock that would hold heat and provide a surface for cooking. He collected dry plant matter that might serve as tinder, testing different materials to see which ones would catch fire most easily. The nutrient bars from the survival kit would last him maybe 3 days if he rationed them carefully. After that, he would need to find his own food. That meant hunting, and hunting meant understanding the creatures that lived here as if responding to his thoughts. A sound emerged from the jungle that made everything else fall silent. It was a deep rumbling roar that seemed to come from the earth itself, a sound so low and powerful that Tay felt it in his chest before he heard it with his ears. The trees shook, its leaves falling like rain, and the ground vibrated beneath his feet with each thunderous footstep. As Tay looked up and saw something massive moving through the jungle in the distance. The creature was enormous. His leaf the size of an elephant, or perhaps larger, with a body covered in spines and armor plates that gleamed in the fading light. Its head was elongated and filled with teeth. So many teeth, visible even from this distance, as it opened its mouth and released another of those earth-shaking roars when it moved. The smaller creatures scattered, running and flying and burrowing in every direction to escape. This, Tay realized, was what the aliens had warned him about. This was the apex predator of Zyrith 7. The creature that had destroyed observation drones and killed every expedition that had ever attempted to study this world. This was the reason why no one survived here, why the planet was classified as one of the deadliest in the known galaxy. He watched it for a long time, memorizing its movement patterns and the sounds it made, cataloging every detail that might be useful later. The creature seemed to prefer the deeper parts of the jungle, staying away from the more open areas near the rock formation. It moved with a slow confidence that suggested it had no natural enemies, nothing that could threaten it, nothing that could make it afraid. Tay thought about his grandmother and the stories she used to tell about Korea in the old days, about times of war and famine, when people had to hunt and forage and fight for every meal. He thought about the survival training he had received in the military, about instructors who had dropped him in deserts and jungles and frozen wastelands and told him to find his way home. He thought about all the times he had faced something that seemed impossible and found a way through anyway. The massive creature disappeared into the deeper parts of the jungle, its thunderous footsteps fading into the distance. And the normal sounds of the environment slowly returned. Tay turned back to his camp and continued working by the time darkness fell. He had a functional shelter built against the rocks, a fire pit ready for use. In a mental map of the immediate area, he had identified 3 different water sources, 2 of which seemed to be contaminated with something that made his eyes water when he got too close. But one that appeared relatively clean. He had noted which plants the smaller creatures avoided, which suggested they might be toxic, and which plants they seemed to eat, which suggested they might be safe. He had also found something interesting near the rock formation. There was a patch of ground where mushrooms grew in thick clusters. They were pale and slightly luminescent, glowing with a soft blue light that pulsed slowly like a heartbeat. When he examined them closely, he noticed that small insects seemed to be attracted to the glow, landing on the mushrooms and then falling over. Apparently stunned or killed by something in the fungus, they did not eat the mushrooms, but he marked their location in his mind. Anything that could stun or kill insects might have other uses. Poisons could become medicines if you knew how to use them. Toxins could become tools. Nature was full of things that seemed dangerous but became useful once you understood their properties. As full darkness descended on Xerath 7, Tay retreated to his shelter and worked on starting a fire. The tinder he had collected caught easily enough, and soon he had a small blaze going in the fire pit, casting dancing shadows on the rocks behind him and pushing back against the chill that was beginning to creep into the air. The temperature had dropped significantly since the sun went down. Confirming what the tribunal had said about extreme variance, he pulled out his grandmother's recipe book and opened it to a random page, holding it close to the fire so he could read the familiar handwriting. The recipe was for kimchi jjigae, the spicy stew that had been a staple of his childhood. His grandmother had made it every Sunday, and the whole house would fill with the smell of fermented vegetables and pork and chili flakes. He could almost taste it now, just from reading the words on the page, the memory so vivid that it made his mouth water. He looked at the list of ingredients and then looked out at the alien jungle surrounding him. Pork belly, tofu, kimchi, gochugaru, garlic, onion, green onion. None of these things existed here, not in any form he would recognize, but the basic elements did: protein from meat, carbohydrates from vegetables, fermentation from bacteria, heat from fire. The specific ingredients were just expressions of a universal process, ways that humans had found to transform raw materials into nourishing food. If he could understand that process at its most fundamental level, he could recreate it with whatever materials were available. To close the book and stared into the flames, watching them dance and flicker in the darkness. Tomorrow, he would begin hunting for real. Tomorrow, would start learning what this world had to offer. What could be eaten and what should be avoided. What could be useful and what was merely dangerous. Tomorrow, he would take the first steps toward turning this death sentence into something else entirely. Somewhere in orbit, far above the planet, a young Velith researcher named Nari was watching. She had been assigned to monitor the human exile as part of her training, a routine task that her supervisors considered beneath them. The job was supposed to be simple and boring: watch the prisoner die and document the process for the official records. Most exiles to Class-9 worlds lasted less than a day. The longest recorded survival time was 11 hours. And that individual had spent most of that time huddled in their drop pod, too terrified to move. But this human had been on the surface for almost 6 hours now, and he showed no signs of dying. Nari watched the footage from the surveillance drone with growing fascination, her compound eyes fixed on the screen as the human built his shelter and started his fire and examined plants with careful attention. She had read all the reports about humans, about their strange planet and their even stranger biology. But reading about something and seeing it with your own eyes were very different experiences. On her screen, the human was sitting by his fire, looking at a small book and making notes with a primitive writing instrument. The expression on his face was not fear or desperation or even resignation. It was focus, concentration. The look of someone who had been given a problem and was methodically working out how to solve it. Nari, she made a note in her observation log, her fingers moving quickly across the interface. Subject remains alive, and appears to be establishing long-term survival. Infrastructure this contradicts all predictive models for exile subjects on Class-9 worlds. Continued monitoring recommended she hesitated for a moment, and then added a personal observation that she would probably delete later before submitting the official report. This is the most interesting assignment I have ever had far below, on the surface of Zerith 7. Tay put away his grandmother's book and lay down to sleep. The sounds of the jungle surrounded him. Clicks and calls, and the distant rumble of the massive predator moving through the darkness, somewhere out there. Things with teeth and claws were hunting. Killing, eating, he smiled slightly, and closed his eyes. Tomorrow was going to be a busy date. Sun rose over Zerith 7 in a blaze of orange and red light that filtered through the dense canopy of the jungle and painted everything in shades of fire. The colors were different than Earth's sunrises, more vivid and more threatening, as if the star itself was warning him about the dangers of the day ahead. Tay had been awake for nearly an hour already, preparing for his first real hunt on this alien world, checking his equipment and running through the plan in his mind until every step was clear. Had spent the previous day watching the creatures of the jungle, observing their patterns and behaviors. From the relative safety of his camp near the rock formation, the armored six-legged things, the ones that had confronted him on his first day, seemed to follow a predictable routine. They gathered in small groups near certain areas of the jungle in the early morning hours. Foraging for food among the roots of the massive trees, they moved carefully, always keeping at least one of their number on watch while the others ate, suggesting that they were prey as well as predators in the complex ecosystem of this world. If he could get close enough without being detected, he might be able to catch one. The knife from the survival kit was almost useless for hunting, its blade too short and too dull to do any real damage against the natural armor that protected most of the creatures here. But Tay had spent part of the previous evening working on a solution. Using skills that his military instructors had taught him years ago, he had found a branch from one of the smaller trees that was straight and strong. About the length of his arm and as thick as his wrist, the wood was dense and heavy, harder than most earth woods, which would give it good penetrating power. Using the knife and a rough stone that he had found near the stream, he had shaped one end into a sharp point, carving away the outer layers and exposing the pale inner wood. Then he had hardened the point in the fire, letting the heat transform the wood fibers into something almost as strong as bone. It was not a perfect spear, not the kind of weapon that could be mass-produced in a factory or purchased from a store, but it would do. It would have to do. Tay left his camp while the light was still dim, moving through the jungle with the careful, deliberate steps that he had learned in forests on Earth and refined in training exercises. Across half a dozen different planets, the ground was treacherous here, covered with roots and loose soil and things that would crunch or squelch if you stepped on them wrong. Every sound could attract attention, and attention from the wrong creature could mean death. He breathed slowly and evenly, keeping his heart rate down and his mind focused. The wet cloth over his face filtered out the worst of the atmospheric toxins, though his eyes still watered occasionally when he passed through patches where the concentration was particularly high. The jungle smelled different in the morning. He noticed less of rot and more of something that reminded him of flowers, a sweet undertone beneath the ever-present sulfur. The foraging creatures were exactly where he expected them to be, gathered in a clearing near the base of one of the massive trees where some kind of fungus grew in thick patches on the roots. There were 5 of them this morning, more than usual, and they moved with the nervous energy of animals that knew they were vulnerable. Their armor plates clicked softly as they walked, and their mouths made wet sounds as they tore chunks of fungus from the roots and swallowed them. Holte watched from behind a thick tree trunk, his body pressed against the scaled bark, his breathing so shallow that his chest barely moved. He observed their behavior, looking for patterns and weaknesses that he could exploit. The creatures stayed in a loose formation, never more than a few meters apart, with the largest of them always positioned between the group and the deeper jungle where larger predators might lurk. They communicated with each other through a series of clicks and chirps, sounds that seemed to carry specific meanings based on how the others reacted. One particular pattern of clicks made them all freeze for a moment, heads swiveling to scan the surrounding trees. Before returning to their feeding, the armor plating was thickest on their backs, Tay noted. Layered scales that looked like they could deflect all but the most powerful attacks. But the plating was thinner on their undersides, particularly around the joints where the legs connected to the body. Their eyes were small and positioned on the sides of their heads, giving them wide peripheral vision, but probably limiting their ability to see directly in front of them, and they had trouble changing direction quickly. Their 6 legs working in a pattern that was efficient for forward movement, but awkward for sudden turns, Tay chose his target. The smallest of the group, slightly separated from the others as it investigated something on the ground, he gripped his spear tightly, feeling the smooth wood against his palm, and took a slow, deep breath. Then he moved. The attack was fast and precise. Using techniques that had been drilled into him during years of training, he closed the distance in 3 quick steps, his feet finding solid ground with each stride. His body low and balanced, the creature heard him coming and tried to turn, its armor plates flaring outward in a defensive posture. But it was too slow. It drove the spear downward with all his weight behind it. Aiming for the gap between the armor plates where the neck joined the body, the hardened wooden point found flesh. Sinking deep, and the creature let out a scream that echoed through the jungle. High and piercing and full of pain, it thrashed violently, trying to shake off the attack, trying to dislodge the spear. But Tay held on with both hands, keeping his weight on the weapon. Keeping the point buried in the creature's body, he could feel it struggling beneath him, muscles contracting and releasing in desperate spasms. But the fight was already over. The spear had found something vital, and the movements grew weaker with each passing second. The other creatures fled at the first scream, crashing through the undergrowth with surprising speed, their armored bodies smashing through plants and roots as they ran. Their clicks and chirps rose to a frantic pitch as they disappeared into the deeper jungle. Warning calls that would probably keep other groups away from this area for hours stayed still after the creature stopped moving. Listening for any sign that something larger had heard the commotion and was coming to investigate, the jungle was quiet for a long moment. That dangerous silence that meant everything was waiting to see what would happen next. Then, gradually, the normal sounds returned, the clicks and calls of smaller creatures resuming their chorus. And Tay allowed himself to relax slightly. He had made his first kill. The creature was heavier than he had expected, and dragging it back to camp took most of the morning. He had to stop frequently to rest and to check his surroundings, always aware that the smell of blood might attract predators that he was not prepared to face. But nothing attacked him, nothing challenged him for his prize. And eventually he made it back to the rock formation where his shelter waited, examined the creature carefully before beginning the butchering process, using the time to learn as much as he could about the animal that had become his first real meal on this world. The armor plates were truly impressive. Layered scales that overlapped like roof tiles and were backed by a tough, leathery hide. It would take significant force to penetrate them. More than his simple spear could deliver in most circumstances. He had been lucky to find that gap at the neck. Internal structure was different from Earth animals, but recognizable. Organs and muscles and bones arranged in patterns that served similar functions. The creature had lungs, or something like them. Large sacs that had processed the toxic atmosphere. The digestive system was complex. Multiple stomachs or chambers that had broken down the tough fungus it fed on. The blood was darker than human blood, almost purple, and it had a smell that reminded Tay of copper. The meat itself was dark red, almost purple like the blood, with a texture that reminded him of beef or venison. It was dense and muscular, the flesh of an animal that had spent its life moving and fighting and running. The fat was distributed differently than in Earth animals, concentrated in certain areas rather than marbled throughout, which would affect how it cooked. Tay cut a small piece and examined it closely, looking for any signs of parasites or contamination. His survival training had emphasized caution with unknown foods, the importance of cooking everything thoroughly, of testing small amounts before eating larger meals. The creatures of this world had evolved in an environment that was toxic to most life forms, which meant their bodies might contain substances that could harm him. He built up the fire in his pit and placed the small piece of meat on one of the flat cooking stones. After a few minutes, the smell of cooking meat filled the air, Familiar and comforting despite the alien source, the fat sizzled and popped as it rendered. And the meat changed color, darkening to a rich brown that looked almost appetizing. When it was done, he let it cool slightly, then took a small bite and chewed slowly. The flavor was strange. Gamey and rich, with a slight bitterness that might have been from the creature's diet or might have been a natural. Characteristic of the meat, the texture was tough. Chewy in a way that would benefit from longer cooking or some kind of tenderizing process, but it was edible, it was protein, it was food. Tay ate a bit more. Still cautious, still watching his body for any adverse reactions, his stomach did not rebel. His throat did not swell. His vision did not blur with each passing minute. His confidence grew. This was something he could eat. Something he could survive on. He spent the rest of the day processing the kill. Using every part of the creature that he could. There was more meat than he could eat fresh. Far more. So preservation became critical. He had noticed that smoke from certain types of wood seemed to drive away the insects that swarmed around anything organic. So he expanded his shelter to include a small enclosed area where smoke could circulate. The smokehouse was crude. Walls of woven branches sealed with mud from the stream. A roof of broad leaves layered to trap the smoke inside. He built a small fire at the base and fed it with the wood that produced the most pungent smoke. Watching carefully to make sure the temperature stayed low enough to cure the meat without cooking it further. Strips of meat hung from frames made of branches, turning slowly from red to dark brown as the smoke did its work. By evening, he had the beginnings of a real food supplier. Watched all of this from her observation post in orbit. Her screen showing multiple angles of the human camp as recorded by the surveillance drone that had been sent to document his death. She had been monitoring him for days now, and each day brought new surprises. New behaviors that contradicted everything she thought she knew about survival and adaptation. The human was not just surviving, he was thriving. He was building infrastructure, creating systems, establishing processes that would sustain him. Far beyond the initial emergency period, she had watched him hunt and butcher and preserve food with an efficiency that suggested long practice. Movements that were automatic and precise, and now he was doing something that she had never seen. A survival subject due before he was cooking. Not just heating food to make it safe, but actually cooking. Combining ingredients and adjusting flavors and treating the process as something worthy of care and attention. She did not understand why anyone would spend extra effort on food preparation when survival was uncertain. But the humans seemed to consider it important enough to invest significant time and resources. Her supervisor, Arbiter Quillos himself, had checked in once during the past few days, demanding to know when the human would die. Nari had reported that the subject was still alive and had begun establishing hunting and food preservation protocols. Quillos had made a sound of disgust and told her to notify him when something interesting happened. Meaning when the human was finally killed by the environment or the predators. But Nari found the current situation very interesting indeed. She pulled up the files on Earth, the human's home planet, reading through them again with new understanding. The planet was classified as Class 7. Moderately dangerous by galactic standards, but as she read the details, she began to wonder if that classification was accurate. Earth had active volcanic zones that could destroy entire regions without warning. The tectonic plates shifted constantly, causing earthquakes that leveled cities and tsunamis that drowned coastlines. Weather systems produced winds strong enough to demolish buildings and floods that could submerge entire territories. The atmosphere was full of oxygen, a highly reactive gas that made fires possible and caused metal to rust and organic matter to decay. The native wildlife included predators with teeth and claws and venom, parasites that invaded bodies and reproduced inside them, diseases that could kill in hours or take years to destroy their hosts. And the humans had not just survived there, they had become the dominant species on the planet, spreading to every continent, adapting to every environment, conquering every challenge that their world threw at them. It tamed fire and built cities and eventually reached out into space, carrying their strange resilience with them wherever they went. Nari looked at the screen, showing Tay tending to his smokehouse, his face illuminated by the glow of the fire. and she felt something she had never felt before when observing an alien species. She felt impressed the days passed. And Tay settled into a routine that became more refined with each cycle of the strange sun. He hunted when he needed food, targeting the armored creatures that had proven to be edible and avoiding the larger predators that roamed the deeper jungle. He expanded his garden, transplanting some of the edible plants to the area near his camp where he could tend them and protect them from the local wildlife. He improved his shelter, adding walls and a better roof and a proper door that could be closed against the night hand. He experimented with cooking the root vegetable he had found near. The stream had a texture like potato when boiled, starchy and filling, but bland on its own. It absorbed other flavors well, though, taking on the taste of whatever it was cooked with. The fungus that tasted like garlic added depth and complexity to his dishes, that pungent note that made other ingredients come alive. He found another plant with leaves that had a slight bitterness, like cabbage or mustard greens, that provided variety and helped balance the richness of the meat. He tried fermentation, using the garlic fungus and its natural bacteria to transform some of the bitter leaves into something tangy and complex. The process took days, but the result was remarkable, a flavor profile that was not quite kimchi, but was definitely fermented, sour and sharp and alive with beneficial organisms that would help his digestion. One morning, about 2 weeks after his arrival, Tay decided to attempt something more ambitious. He gathered his ingredients carefully, selecting the best pieces of smoked meat and the freshest vegetables from his garden. He prepared the garlic fungus and the fermented leaves and the starchy root, cutting everything into pieces that would cook at similar rates. Then he combined them in a depression in one of his large flat stones, a crude pot that he had shaped with patience and effort over several days. He added water from the stream and set it over the fire to simmer them. Smell that rose from the cooking stew was not kimchi jjigae, not the dish his grandmother had made every Sunday in her small kitchen in Seoul, but it was something that was warm and savory and complex, layers of flavor building on each other. Meat and vegetables and fermentation and smoke. He let it cook for hours, adding water when it got too thick, adjusting the heat to maintain a gentle simmer. The aroma filled his camp and drifted into the jungle, and he wondered if the local creatures could smell it too, if they knew that something new was happening in their world. When it was finally ready, Tay ladled some of the stew into a bowl he had made from a hollowed gourd. He looked at it for a moment. This strange creation, born from alien ingredients and ancient recipes, from desperation and determination and the stubborn human refusal to give up. Then he tasted it. The flavor hit him like a wave, rich and complex and surprisingly familiar. Despite the alien origins, the meat was tender now, broken down by the long cooking, and it melded with the vegetables in a harmony that reminded him of home. The fermented leaves provided that sour note he had been missing, and the garlic fungus gave it depth. The starchy root had absorbed all these flavors and become something greater than the sum of its parts. It was not perfect. There was no heat, no spice, no gochugaru to make his nose run and his eyes water. The balance was not quite right. Too much of one flavor and not enough of another. But it was good. It was real food, prepared with care and intention. And it nourished something more than just his body. Tay closed his eyes and let the taste transport him back to his grandmother's kitchen, back to Sunday afternoons filled with steam and laughter and the smell of fermented vegetables. He could almost hear her voice, telling him about the importance of balance, about how cooking was not just about following recipes, but about understanding the principles behind them. "You did good, Grandma," he said quietly. "To no one, you taught me well, somewhere in orbit." Nari was watching, and she saw the human sitting alone by his fire, eating from a gourd bowl and smiling. She did not understand what he was smiling about, could not comprehend the memories and emotions that were moving through him. But she recognized that something important was happening, something that went beyond simple survival. She made a note in her observation log, struggling to find the right words to describe what she was. Seeing subject has developed what appears to be a sophisticated food preparation system using local ingredients. The behavior suggests cultural practices that extend beyond basic nutritional requirements. Further study recommended. She paused, then added one more line. "I think I am beginning to understand why humans are so resilient back on the surface." Tay finished his stew and cleaned his cooking stones. He looked up at the sky, knowing that somewhere up there a drone was watching. Recording everything he did, he thought about the tribunal and Quillos and all the aliens who had expected him to die within days. He thought about his grandmother and her recipes, in the family tradition that stretched back generations. Then he smiled and raised his bowl toward the sky in a mock toast, 3.5 stars. He said to the invisible watchers, not bad for a Deathworld, would recommend for adventurous eaters. He laughed at his own joke, the sound echoing through the alien jungle, and got back to work. There was still so much. 2 to 3 weeks had passed since Tay was dropped on Zyrith 7, and his camp had transformed from a desperate survival outpost into something that almost resembled a home. The shelter had expanded 3 times now, with proper walls made from woven branches sealed with clay from the riverbank, a roof layered thick enough to keep out the heaviest rains, and separate areas for sleeping and cooking and storage. He had built a proper smokehouse with multiple chambers, where different types of meat could cure at different rates, and a storage area lined with leaves that seemed to repel insects, where he kept his dried plants and roots and the various ingredients he had been collecting. The garden had grown as well, a patch of cleared ground near the thermal vents where he cultivated the edible plants he had discovered. Some of them he had transplanted from other parts of the jungle, carefully digging up their roots and moving them to this protected space. Others he had grown from seeds or cuttings, experimenting to see what would thrive under his care. The starchy root grew well in the warm soil near the vents, and the bitter leaves spread quickly. Once he cleared away the competing vegetation, the garlic fungus was more difficult, preferring the shade of the larger trees. But he had managed to establish a small patch on the north side of the rock formation, where the light was dim. He had a routine now, a rhythm to his days that gave structure to his existence. He woke before dawn and checked his traps, simple snares he had constructed from plant fibers that occasionally caught small creatures. He tended his garden and checked his smokehouse and gathered water from the stream he hunted when his supplies ran low. Targeting different creatures now that he had learned more about what lived in this jungle, he cooked meals twice a day, breakfast and dinner, treating each one as an opportunity to experiment and improve it all. He thought about his grandmother's recipe book. The small notebook was his most treasured possession, more valuable than any tool or weapon he had created. Its pages were worn soft from years of handling, the binding loose in places, the paper stained with memories of countless meals prepared in kitchens across 2 continents every night before sleep. He would open it and read through the recipes, not to follow them exactly, but to remind himself of the principles they embodied. His grandmother had taught him that cooking was not about ingredients. It was about understanding, about recognizing the fundamental transformations that happened when heat was applied to food, when time was given for flavors to develop, when different components were combined in ways that enhanced each other. A recipe was just a map, she had said, a guide that showed you where others had gone before. But the best cooks were explorers who could find their own paths, who could look at unfamiliar ingredients and see the potential within them. Tay had been exploring for weeks now, learning the landscape of flavors that Zyrith 7 had to offer. Some of his experiments had failed, dishes that were bland or bitter or had textures that made him gag. Others had succeeded beyond his expectations, combinations that worked together in ways he had not anticipated. He had filled pages of his own notes in the margins of his grandmother's book, recording what he had tried and what he had learned. But there was one dish that he had not yet attempted, one recipe that he had been building toward ever since he arrived. Kimchi jjigae. Stew was more than just food to him. It was memory made tangible, a direct connection to his childhood and his family and everything he had left behind on Earth. His grandmother had made it every Sunday without fail, and the smell of it cooking had been the backdrop to some of his happiest memories. Sitting at the kitchen table doing homework while she stirred the pot, watching her adjust the seasonings with practiced ease, helping her chop vegetables when he was old enough to be trusted with a knifey. Could not recreate it exactly. The specific ingredients did not exist here, might not exist anywhere in the galaxy except Earth. But he had been working toward a version that captured the essence of the dish, the warmth and the depth and the complex interplay of flavors that made it special. Today was the day he would attempt. Woke earlier than usual and began his preparations. While the sky was still dark, the meat came from his smokehouse. Pieces he had set aside specifically for this purpose. They were not pork belly. Not even close. But they had been cut in a similar way. With both meat and fat included to give richness to the broth, he had soaked them overnight in water to remove some of the smoke flavor. Leaving behind just a hint of depth, the vegetables came from his garden. Harvested fresh that morning, the starchy roots were cut into chunks that would hold their shape during the long cooking process. The bitter leaves he had fermented for nearly a week. Letting them develop that sour temps that was essential to the dish, the garlic fungus was crushed into a paste. Releasing its pungent aroma into the air, he built a fire in his cooking pit and placed his largest flat stone over it. The one he had spent days hollowing into a proper cooking vessel. The water went in first, collected from the clean part of the stream and filtered through layers of cloth and charcoal, then the meat. Arranged in a single layer so it would brown evenly before the liquid was added, the smell of browning meat filled the camp. Rich and savory and familiar in a way that made his heart ache, he thought about his sister Sue back on Earth. Probably worried about him by now. She would have received the official notification of his exile by now. The cold, bureaucratic statement that he had been sentenced to death on a distant world, he wondered if she knew he was still alive. If news of his survival had reached her somehow. Sue was 4 years younger than him. A marine biologist who spent her days studying the creatures that lived in Earth's oceans. She had always been the smart one in the family. The one who went to university and got degrees and published papers in important journals. Tay had gone a different direction. Joining the military and then drifting into cargo hauling when his service ended, but they had stayed close. Calling each other every week, sharing meals whenever both of them were on Earth at the same time, she would be looking for him. He knew she would not accept the tribunal's verdict without a fight. That was not who she was. He added the fermented leaves to the pot. Watching them darken as they absorbed the heat and the moisture, the garlic fungus went in next. Stirred into the broth until it dissolved and released its flavor, the starchy roots went in last. Settling to the bottom where they would cook slowly and absorb the rich liquid, the stew needed time now. Time for the flavors to meld and deepen. Time for the meat to become tender. Time for everything to come together into something greater than its individual parts. Tay sat back and watched the pot simmer. Stirring occasionally, adjusting the fire to maintain a gentle bubble while he waited, he thought about what he had accomplished in the weeks since his arrival. He had built shelter and secured food and established a sustainable existence on a planet that was supposed to kill him within days. He had faced predators and harsh conditions and the constant threat of death. And he had overcome them all through skill and determination and the stubborn refusal to give up. But survival was not enough. He was alive. Yes, but he was also alone, cut off from everything and everyone he had ever known. The days were busy enough to keep him occupied. But the nights were long, and in the darkness his mind would wander to places he tried to avoid. He thought about his family and his friends, and the life he had left behind. He thought about the tribunal and Quillos and the injustice of being sentenced to death for carrying spices. He thought about the future, the years stretching out ahead of him on this hostile world with no hope of rescue or return. He needed something more than survival. He needed purpose, something to work toward, something to give meaning to his continued existence. The stew bubbled gently in its stone pot, filling the air with aromas that transported him across the light, years to his grandmother's kitchen, and as he sat there watching it cook, an idea began to form in his mind. He thought about the surveillance drone that had been following him since he arrived, recording his every move for some distant observer. He thought about the tribunal's expectation that he would die quickly and quietly, just another statistic in their records of exile sentences. He thought about Quillos and his compound eyes, gleaming with satisfaction as he pronounced the sentence. What if he did something they did not expect? What if he sent a message that they could not ignore? What if he turned this death sentence into something else entirely? Something that would make them regret ever challenging him. Tay smiled as the idea crystallized in his mind. It was absurd, ridiculous. Exactly the kind of thing that humans did and aliens found incomprehensible. He was going to write a restaurant review. Stew was ready after several hours of simmering. The meat tender enough to fall apart at the touch of a spoon, the vegetables soft but not mushy, the broth rich and complex with layers of flavor building on each other. Tay ladled it into his gourd bowl and tasted it carefully, analyzing each element the way his grandmother had taught him. It was not kimchi jjigae, not the dish he remembered from his childhood, but it was good, really good. The best thing he had made since arriving on this planet. The fermented leaves provided that essential sour note. The garlic fungus gave depth and complexity. The meat was rich and satisfying. It was missing the heat, the gochugaru that would have made his nose run and his eyes water. But even without that element, it was a complete dish. A meal that nourished both body and soul. He thought about his grandmother and what she would say if she could see him now. He thought about all the Sunday dinners they had shared, all the lessons she had taught him without ever seeming to teach. He thought about the way she would taste her cooking as she worked, making small adjustments until everything was exactly right. "I think you would be proud, Grandma," he said quietly to the empty air. "I think this would make you smile." He finished the stew and cleaned his cooking stones, then turned his attention to the crashed drop pod at the edge of the clearing. He had explored it briefly when he first arrived, but had not had time for a thorough examination now. With his immediate survival secured, he could afford to investigate more carefully. The pod was half buried in soft earth, tilted at an angle where it had come to rest after the impact vines had grown over it in the weeks since his arrival, covering the hole with a layer of green that made it look almost like part of the landscape, but beneath the vegetation. The metal was still intact, and when Tay forced open the maintenance panels, he found what he was looking for. The communication array had been destroyed by the impact, its delicate electronics reduced to scorched fragments, but some of the basic components were still functional. He found power cells that held a charge, an antenna that appeared undamaged, circuit boards that might still work if he could figure out how to connect them. The pod's computer had contained a basic database about ZERF-7, probably included as some kind of cruel joke. And that system seemed to be partially operational as Tay gathered the useful components and carried them back to his camp. Laying them out on a flat stone and examining each one carefully, he was not an electronics expert, but he had learned basic repair skills during his years as a cargo hauler. Ships broke down in space, far from any help, and the ability to fix things was often the difference between life and death. Transmitter he was imagining did not need to be sophisticated, it just needed to send a signal. Any signal, something that would be picked up by the relay stations that dotted this sector of space, if he could broadcast on the right frequency. His message would be amplified and retransmitted, spreading across the galactic communication networks until it reached every corner of civilized space. He worked for 3 days, sleeping only a few hours at a time, eating meals that he prepared almost absent-mindedly. While his mind focused on the technical challenges before him, the power cells were straightforward. Their energy output compatible with the other components. The antenna needed repairs, several of its delicate elements bent or broken, but he managed to straighten them with patience and care. The real challenge was the circuit board, the complex web of connections that would convert his voice into a signal and send it out into the void on the 3rd day. He finished. The transmitter was ugly, a mess of wires and salvaged parts held together with strips of bark in desperate hope. But when he connected the power cells, a small light flickered on, and he heard a faint hum that told him the system was working. He was receiving fragments of transmissions from distant sources, garbled voices and bursts of data that confirmed his antenna was functional. He could send a message, and somewhere out there, someone would hear it. Tay sat in front of his creation and thought about what to say. A distress call would be pointless. The galactic community had written him off as dead, and a simple plea for help would probably be dismissed as a malfunction or a hoax. He needed something that would catch attention, something that would spread, something that people would talk about and share and remember. And then it came to him, the perfect message for this perfect moment. If the aliens thought he was going to die on this world, they expected fear and desperation and pleas for mercy. They did not expect humor. They did not expect confidence. They certainly did not expect a restaurant review. He pulled out his grandmother's recipe book and opened it to the page where he had written his notes about the kimchi jjigae experiment. He looked at the words he had scrawled in the margins, observations about ingredients and techniques and flavors. and he smiled somewhere on the other side of the galaxy. His sister Sue was working late in her laboratory when her communication device buzzed with an incoming message. She glanced at it. Expecting something routine? A colleague asking a question or an automated notification from one of her research systems instead? She found a message from a contact she barely remembered. A traitor who owed her brother a favor. The message was brief and devastating. Your brother has been exiled. Class-9 world. Zyrith 7 no. Retrieval. Expected condolences. Sue read the words 3 times. Trying to make sense of them, she pulled up the Galactic database and searched for Zyrith 7. And what she found made her stomach drop. The planet was a death sentence. One of the most dangerous worlds in known space survival time was measured in hours, but she knew her brother. She knew what he was capable of. What he had survived in the past. She knew that giving up was not in his nature. She started making calls, reaching out to everyone she knew who might be able to help: the diplomatic corps, the legal advocates, the intelligence contacts that Tay had mentioned over the years. She would not accept this. She would not let her brother die alone on a hostile world without at least trying to save him far away. On the surface of Zyrith 7, Tay activated his transmitter and began to speak. This is a message for the Galactic Communication Network. My name is Tay, and I am currently residing on the planet Zyrith 7, Class-9 Deathworld. Sector 47, I would like to submit a formal review of my experience here for the benefit of any future travelers who might find themselves in similar circumstances. He paused for effect, imagining the confusion his words would cause. Zyrith 7, 3.5 out of 5 stars. Then he began to speak in earnest, describing the atmosphere and the temperature and the wildlife with the calm detail of someone reviewing a restaurant or a hotel. He talked about the toxic air and how to filter it, about the predators and how to avoid them, about the food and how to prepare it. He talked about his camp and his smokehouse and his garden, about the meals he had cooked and the techniques he had developed. And when he was finished, he signed off with words that would echo across the galaxy. Would recommend for adventurous eaters. Will update when I attempt dessert. Tay signing off. He deactivated the transmitter and sat back, wondering if anyone would hear, wondering if it would make any difference. But somewhere in the vast darkness between the stars, his words were already spreading, bouncing from relay station to relay station, multiplying and amplifying until they touched every corner of civilized space the galaxy was about to discover. What humans were really made of. The message spread faster than anyone could have predicted. Within hours of Tay's transmission, his restaurant review had been intercepted by civilian monitoring stations across 3 sectors. Someone, probably a board communications officer looking for something interesting to break up the monotony of their shift, had recognized the unusual nature of the broadcast and uploaded it to a public network. From there it jumped to entertainment channels and news feeds and discussion forums, spreading like wildfire through the vast interconnected web of galactic communications. Species that had never heard of humans were suddenly watching footage of one sitting calmly on a death world, describing the local cuisine as if he were reviewing a vacation resort. Species that had heard of humans but dismissed them as primitive newcomers were reconsidering their assumptions as they listened to this strange creature discuss fermentation techniques and smoking methods everywhere the message touched. It sparked conversations and debates and a kind of fascinated horror that kept viewers coming back for more. The reactions were mixed, as they always were when humans did something that the galaxy found incomprehensible. Some found it hilarious. The idea of reviewing a Class-9 world like it was a restaurant struck many beings as absurdly funny, the kind of cosmic joke that only made sense if you accepted that the universe was fundamentally ridiculous. Clips of the recording were remixed and shared with commentary, and the phrase 3.5 stars became a meme in several languages almost overnight. There were images and videos referencing Tay's review spreading across every platform, each one adding new layers of humor to the original message. Others found it terrifying. The humans' calm confidence in the face of certain death challenged everything they thought they knew about survival and adaptation. They had expected the human to die quickly, so all the others had died, crushed by the weight of an environment that no being could withstand. Instead, he was thriving, building shelter and growing food and cooking. Meals that sounded genuinely appealing if a single human could do this on Zyrith 7. What else were humans capable of? What would happen when they turned that resilience and creativity toward less benign purposes? Old fears about the dangerous species from Earth began to resurface in forums and discussions that had been quiet for years. Some called for restrictions on human travel and trade. Others demanded that Earth be removed from the galactic community entirely before they became a real threat. A few, mostly scientists and researchers, called for more study, arguing that understanding humans might be more valuable than fearing them in the Velith High Council chambers. The reaction was neither amusement nor fear. It was fury. High Arbiter Quillos watched the recording for the 17th time, his compound eyes fixed on the screen with an intensity that made his aides shrink back against the walls of his private office. The human was supposed to be dead. The human was definitely supposed to be dead. The tribunal had sentenced him to exile on one of the deadliest worlds in the known galaxy, a planet where even the most advanced observation technology lasted less than 3 days, and instead of dying, the human was sitting there reviewing the food and making jokes about apex predators and becoming famous across the entire galaxy. This is unacceptable, Quillo said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. He has made a mockery of our justice system. The entire galaxy is watching and laughing at us. His senior aide, a thin Velith named Cass, stepped forward carefully with respect. Arbiter, the situation may not be as damaging as you fear. Many species view the human survival as an aberration, statistical anomaly that proves nothing about our sentencing practices. An anomaly, Quillos repeated, his multiple arms clicking against each other in a gesture of extreme agitation. He has been on that planet for nearly 4 weeks, has built shelter and established food production, and sent a message, mocking us to every corner of civilized space. This is not an anomaly. This is a catastrophe. What do you suggest we do? Cass asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer and did not like it. We cannot send a retrieval mission to a Class-9 world. The losses would be catastrophic, and the political fallout would be even worse. We do not need to retrieve him, Quillo said, and there was something cold and calculating in his voice that made Cass step back another pace. We need to control the narrative. The human survived through luck. Nothing more. He found a pocket of the planet that was less hostile than the average, and he exploited it through primitive techniques that any species could replicate. We will issue a statement explaining that Zyrith 7 was selected specifically because it was survivable, and that his continued existence proves the mercy of our sentence rather than any flaw in our judgment. Cass was quiet for a moment, processing this suggestion with respect. Arbiter, no one will believe that every species in the galaxy knows the classification system. They know what Class 9 means. They have seen the survival statistics. Then we adjust the classification. Quillo snapped, his patience finally breaking. We reclassify Zyrith 7 as a Class 7 world. Effective immediately, we altered the historical records to show that it was always borderline. That new research led to a reassessment of its danger. Level problem solved. The aide stared at his superior with something approaching horror. This was a level of dishonesty that even the Velith Tribunal rarely attempted. It would require falsifying official records, bribing or threatening scientists, coordinating a cover-up that spanned multiple departments and agencies. The risks were enormous. The consequences, if they were caught, would be devastating. But Quillos was desperate, and desperate beings made desperate decisions. I will begin the preparations, Cass said quietly, knowing that he had no choice. But I must warn you, Arbiter, there are other factors in play now. The humans' transmission has reached Earth, and their diplomatic corps is already making inquiries. They may demand his release. Let them demand, Quillo said, his voice dripping with contempt. Earth has no standing in this sector. They are newcomers, barely civilized, with no allies and no leverage. Their protests will be noted and ignored. Cass bowed and withdrew, leaving Quillos alone with his fury and his schemes on the observation station orbiting Zyrith 7. Nari was having a very different reaction to the viral recording she had been monitoring Tay since his arrival. Watching him survive and adapt and create with a fascination that had grown stronger with each passing day, she had documented his hunting techniques and his construction methods and his cooking experiments, filling report after report with observations that her superiors showed little interest in reading now. Watching his message spread across the galaxy, she felt a strange mix of emotions that she struggled to identify. Perhaps that the subject she had been studying was finally getting the recognition he deserved. Excitement that the galaxy was being forced to reconsider its assumptions about humans' worry about what Quillos might do in response to this. Embarrassment, fear, a small voice in the back of her mind that her own role in monitoring Tay might become a liability. She had filed her reports accurately and honestly, documenting everything she observed without editorializing or spinning the facts. But accuracy was not always what the High Council wanted, and she had seen what happened to researchers who produced inconvenient findings. Her communication console chimed with an incoming message, and she felt her stomach drop when she saw the sender, High Arbiter Quillos. Direct transmission she opened. The message with trembling hands, researcher Nari, your observation post has been reassigned. You are to join a retrieval assessment team that will evaluate the situation on Xyrith 7 and determine appropriate next steps. Report to Docking Bay 7 at 0800 hours tomorrow. This assignment is classified and should not be discussed with anyone outside the team. Do not fail me, Nari. Read the message twice. Her mind racing. Retrieval assessment that meant they were actually considering sending people to the surface of the planet. Something that had never been done before on a Class 9 world. The risks were enormous.
Ow.
The logistics nearly impossible, and yet Quillos was ordering it, which meant he was either desperate or planning something that he did not want to commit to writing. She thought about Tay, alone on the planet below. Unaware of the political storms his message had triggered, she thought about the meals she had watched him prepare. The care and attention he gave to his cooking, even when survival was uncertain. She thought about his grandmother's recipe book, and the way he held it like it was the most precious thing in the universe. She made a decision before reporting to Docking Bay 7. She would send a message of her own, not through official channels, where it would be monitored and traced, but through the back channels she had learned to navigate. During her years in the research division, the message would be short and untraceable, and it would go to the one person who might be able to help the human sister far across the galaxy. In her small apartment in Seoul, Sue was staring at the recording of her brother's message for the 100th time. She had cried the first time she watched it. Great heaving sobs of relief that he was alive mixed with frustration that she could not reach him. She had laughed the second time. Recognizing her brother's dry humor in every word, that same deadpan delivery that had made family dinners so entertaining, she had analyzed it the third and fourth and fifth times, looking for clues about his condition and his surroundings and anything else that might help her bring him home. He looked thin, but healthy, his face darker from sun exposure, but still carrying that same calm confidence that had always defined him. His shelter was visible in the background. Walls of woven branches and a roof of broad leaves, and she could see the smoke rising from what must be his smokehouse. The garden he mentioned was probably just out of frame. Rows of alien plants that he had somehow convinced to grow under his care. Her brother was not just surviving, he was thriving. And that made everything both better and worse. Better because it meant she had time. That he was not in immediate danger of dying. Better because his viral message had given her leverage, something to work with in her negotiations with the diplomatic corps. Better because the whole galaxy was watching now, and that attention might force the Velith to back down. Worse because the attention also made the situation more volatile, more unpredictable. Worse because powerful beings did not like to be embarrassed, and Quillos would be looking for ways to save face. Worse because every day that passed was another day her brother spent alone on a hostile world, separated from everyone who loved him. Her communication device buzzed with an incoming message, and she glanced at it, expecting another update from her diplomatic contacts. Instead, she found something unexpected, a message from an anonymous sender, routed through so many relay stations that its origin was completely untraceable. Your brother is alive and well. I've been watching him since his arrival. He is remarkable. The High Council is preparing a response to his message that may involve sending a team to the surface. I do not know what they are planning, but I do not trust them. If you can find a way to be part of the retrieval effort, you may be able to protect him. Someone named Nari. Sue read the message 3 times, her heart racing. This was either a genuine offer of help or a trap designed to draw her into doing something that would compromise her.
Yeah?
Efforts either way. It told her something important. There were people within the Velith system who were not loyal to Quillos. who might be willing to help if she could find a way to reach them. She picked up her communication device and began making calls. The next few days were a blur of negotiations and arguments, and careful diplomatic maneuvering. Earth's representatives met with Valeth officials in a series of increasingly tense sessions, each side trying to gain advantage while avoiding an open breach. The viral recording had changed the political calculus, making it impossible for the Veleth to simply ignore the situation. But they were still resistant to any action that might make them look weak. Finally, after days of deadlock, a compromise was reached. Joint mission would be sent to Zyrith 7, consisting of Veleth crew members and human observers. The official purpose would be to assess the situation and determine appropriate next steps. A deliberately vague mandate that gave both sides room to claim victory. The Veleth would maintain operational control, but the humans would have full access to observe and report and sue. Through a combination of persistence and threats and calling in every favor she had ever earned, secured a place on the mission. "You are not a diplomat," the Earth representative told her for the dozenth time. His voice tired from arguing. "You have no experience with interstellar relations. You are a marine biologist." "For heaven's sake, he is my brother," Sue replied, her voice steady and uncompromising. "And I am going." The representative looked at her for a long moment, seeing something in her eyes that reminded him of the human on the recording, that same stubborn determination that refused to accept defeat. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "The ship leaves tomorrow," he said. "Do not make me regret this." On Zyrith 7, Tay had no way of knowing what his message had set in motion. He went about his daily routines, hunting and foraging and cooking and building, unaware that billions of beings across the galaxy were watching his every move through the surveillance drone that still hovered at the edge of his camp. He improved his shelter and expanded his gardens and experimented with new recipes, treating each day as an opportunity to learn something new about this strange world that had become his home. He had found a type of fruit that grew on vines near the thermal vents, small purple spheres that were tart and sweet at the same time. They were not filling on their own, but they added a brightness to his dishes that had been missing, a high note that balanced the rich depth of the meat and the sour temps of the fermented vegetables. He was working on a dessert now, a simple preparation that combined the fruit with a sweetener he had extracted from another plant, cooked slowly until it thickened into something like jam. The nights were still long and lonely, but they were easier now. He had purpose, work that gave meaning to his days and helped push back the darkness when it threatened to overwhelm him. He had his grandmother's recipe book and the memories it contained, a connection to his past that kept him grounded. Even in this alien place, he had the satisfaction of seeing his cooking improve, of creating dishes that would have made his family proud, and he had hope, a fragile thing that he guarded carefully, the belief that somehow, someday, things would change. He did not know that change was already on its way, hurtling through the darkness between the stars at faster than light speed. He did not know that his sister was coming one morning. About 5 weeks after his arrival, Tay woke to find something new in the sky, a light that had not been there before. Moving against the fixed pattern of the stars, a ship, descending through the atmosphere of Zyrith 7, stood in the doorway of his shelter and watched it come down. His heart beating faster than it had since those first desperate days. His hand found his spear, gripping it tightly, though he knew it would be useless against whatever was coming. The ship was Veleth in design, sleek and angular with a distinctive bronze coloring of official government vessels. It descended through the cloud cover with a rumble that shook the trees, its engines leaving trails of fire in the morning air. Tay did not know if this was rescue or execution, salvation or the final chapter of his exile, but whatever it was, he would face it standing up. He watched the ship touch down in the clearing near his original crash site, watched the ramp extend from its hull, watched the figures emerge into the toxic air of his world, and then he saw her, climbing down the ramp behind the alien soldiers, her face covered with a breathing mask but her eyes unmistakable. His sister Sue had come for him. "You absolute idiot," she said as she ran toward him, her voice muffled by the mask, but her emotion clear in every word. She crashed into him with enough force to stagger them both. her arms wrapping around him in a hug that squeezed the breath from his lungs. A restaurant review really. Tay held her tightly. Feeling tears on his cheeks that he had not noticed forming it got your attention. Didn't it? She pulled back and looked at him. Really looked? Taking in the changes that weeks of survival had wrought. Her brother was thinner and darker and stronger, transformed by his ordeal into something that was still familiar but also fundamentally different. There was a calm in his eyes that had not been there before, a peace that came from facing death and choosing to live anyway. "I hate you," she said, and then hugged him again behind them. The Velith soldiers were fanning out across the clearing, their weapons ready, but their expressions uncertain. It expected to find a corpse or at best a desperate survivor clinging to the edge of existence instead. They found a settlement with proper structures and gardens, and a smokehouse with meat curing. Inside they found evidence of planning and adaptation and long-term survival. On a world that was supposed to be uncertain, they found a human who did not seem afraid of them. Nari approached, more slowly, hanging back while the siblings reunited. When Sue finally released her brother, the Velith researcher stepped forward and bowed her head in greeting. "It is good to see you well," she said quietly. "I have been watching you for a long time. I am glad to finally meet you in person." Tay looked at her, recognizing something in her voice that spoke of genuine concern rather than professional detachment. "You are the one who has been monitoring me, the one who sent the message to my sister?" Narice's exoskeleton shifted in what might have been embarrassment. "I wanted to help. I did not know what the High Council was planning. And I thought your family should have a chance to be involved. Thank you." Tay said simply. "That took courage." One of the soldiers approached, his weapon lowered but his posture still tense. "We need to move. The ship cannot stay on the surface indefinitely. The atmospheric conditions will cause damage if we remain too long." Tay nodded. Understanding, he looked around his camp one last time, at the shelter he had built and the garden he had planted and the smokehouse that had fed him through weeks of exile. This place had been his prison and his salvation, the site of his greatest challenge and his greatest triumph. Leaving it felt like abandoning a part of himself, but his sister was here, and that changed everything. "Give me a moment," he said. "I need to pack." He gathered the things that mattered most, his grandmother's recipe book. Of course, the worn pages filled with memories and wisdom, a collection of seeds from his garden, saved carefully for potential future use, some of his dried ingredients and fermented preparations, samples of what he had created on this alien world. The soldiers watched him with expressions that ranged from confusion to grudging respect. They had come expecting to retrieve a body, or at worst, a broken survivor instead. They were watching a man calmly pack up his kitchen ready, Tay said finally. His bag slung over his shoulder, the group made their way back to the ship. Moving quickly through the jungle, the soldiers were nervous, their weapons sweeping at every sound, their eyes scanning the shadows for threats. They had read the reports about Xyrith 7, knew the statistics about survival rates, and every moment on the surface felt like borrowed time. But Tay walked calmly, pointing out plants and creatures to his sister as they passed. Explaining what he had learned about this world over the weeks of his exile, Sue listened with the focus of a scientist, asking questions and making mental notes, treating his knowledge as valuable data rather than survival trivia. The big predators mostly hunt at night, Tay explained as they passed through a dense section of undergrowth. They have poor eyesight in bright light, so staying visible during the day is actually safer. The smaller creatures are more of a threat. In some ways they are curious and aggressive, and they travel in groups. You named one of them, Steve, Sue said, and there was laughter in her voice. He seemed like a Steve. They reached the ship without incident and boarded quickly. The engines fired the moment the ramp sealed, lifting them away from the surface and into the relative safety of the upper atmosphere. Tay watched through a viewport as Xyrith 7 fell away beneath them, the jungle shrinking to a carpet of green, the rock formation where he had built his camp becoming just another shadow in the vast landscape. He had survived, he had thrived, he had sent a message that changed how the galaxy saw his species, and now he was going home. What happens next? He asked, turning to face the others. Nari and Sue exchanged a look that suggested complicated politics and difficult negotiations ahead. The High Council is still deciding. Nari said carefully, "Your message created significant problems for them. They may try to save face by claiming that your survival proves their mercy. They may try to make an example of you to discourage others." Or, Sue added, "They may find that the political cost of continuing this farce is too high. Earth is demanding your release. And other species are starting to ask questions about Velith justice, if they are smart. They will let you go and pretend the whole thing never happened. And if they are not smart, then things get more complicated." Tay nodded. Accepting this, he had never expected his survival to be simple. And he was not surprised that the aftermath was equally messy. But he was alive. And his sister was here, and whatever came next, he would face it the same way he had faced everything else, one step at a time. The ship broke through the atmosphere and entered the darkness of space, leaving Zerith 7 behind. The stars surrounded them, cold and distant. The same stars that had watched over Tay during his weeks of exile. Somewhere among them was Earth, his home. The place where his grandmother had taught him to cook, and his sister had grown up beside him. He thought about the meals he would make when he returned, the recipes he would develop using the techniques he had learned. The seeds in his bag might grow in Earth's soil, producing alien vegetables that could be prepared in traditional ways. The knowledge he had gained might help others. Future humans who found themselves in desperate situations on hostile worlds, and perhaps, just perhaps, he would open a restaurant, a place where the food told stories, where every dish carried the memory of survival and adaptation and the stubborn human refusal to give up, a place where people could taste what it meant to turn a death sentence into a culinary adventure. He smiled at the thought and settled into his seat for the long journey ahead. The hardest part was over. The rest was just cooking. The Galactic Tribunal station looked different when you were not in chains. Tay walked through the corridors with his sister on one side and Nari on the other, flanked by a delegation of Earth's diplomats in formal attire that seemed designed to project authority and seriousness. A small army of media drones from a dozen different species followed at a regulated distance, their cameras capturing every moment for audiences across the galaxy. The news of his return had spread almost as quickly as his original restaurant review, and everyone wanted to see what would happen next. The last time he had been here, he had been a prisoner, dragged through these same corridors on his way to what was supposed to be certain death. He had noticed the architecture then, the curved walls and organic shapes that made the station feel like the inside of some massive creature. But he had not had time to appreciate the details now. Walking freely with his head held high, he saw the station for what it was, a monument to power, designed to intimidate visitors and remind them of their place in the galactic hierarchy. Was not working to. Felt many things as he approached the tribunal chamber, but intimidation was not among them. He had survived a death world. He had faced predators that could tear him apart with a single bite. He had built a life from nothing in an environment that was supposed to kill him within days. After all of that, a room full of bureaucrats in fancy chairs seemed almost laughably mundane. The chamber was packed when they arrived, every seat filled with beings who had come to witness what promised to be one of the most significant tribunal sessions in recent memory. The air hummed with tension and anticipation, the buzz of countless conversations conducted in languages that the translation systems could barely keep up with. When Tay entered through the main doors, a wave of silence spread across the crowd, heads turning to stare at the human who had done the impossible. He walked to the center of the chamber and stood on the same platform where he had received his sentence. Weeks ago, the blue light surrounded him again, but this time it felt less like a spotlight and more like a stage. He was not a prisoner anymore. He was a performer. And this was his audience. High Arbiter Quillos sat on his elevated throne, looking exactly as Tay remembered him, thin and angular, with an exoskeleton that gleamed like polished bronze and compound eyes that held nothing but contempt. His multiple arms moved in agitated patterns as he watched the human take his position, clicking against the armrests of his throne in a rhythm that suggested barely controlled rage. The other council members were arranged in their positions around Quillos, but Tay noticed that many of them looked uncomfortable. Several would not meet his gaze, their eyes sliding away whenever he looked in their direction. One A younger Velith with softer features than the others seemed almost sympathetic, her posture leaning slightly forward as if she wanted to hear what he had to say. Human designation Tay of Earth, Quillos began, his voice carrying the same grating quality that Tay remembered from his sentencing. You have returned from your exile. This tribunal demands an explanation for your presence in this chamber. Tay let the silence stretch for a moment before responding. Letting the weight of the occasion settle over the crowd, he thought about all the things he could say. All the arguments and accusations he could level at the beings who had tried to kill him. He thought about the injustice of his original sentence, the cruelty of dropping a man on a death world for the crime of carrying spices. He thought about the fear and loneliness of those first days, the uncertainty of not knowing if he would survive to see another sunrise. But when he spoke, his voice was calm and measured. Carrying clearly through the chamber, you sentenced me to death, he said simply. You dropped me on a Class-9 world and expected me to die. I did not die, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Beings reacting to the blunt honesty of his words, Quillos shifted on his throne, his arms clicking faster. Your survival was unexpected, the arbiter admitted. Though the words seemed to cost him, but it does not change the fundamental facts of your case. You were convicted of smuggling banned substances across multiple sectors. The exile was a merciful alternative to other punishments that were available to this tribunal. Tay nodded slowly, as if considering the point. I was convicted of transporting chili flakes spices for cooking. He paused, letting the absurdity of the situation sink in. I spent 37 days on one of the most dangerous planets in the known galaxy because I wanted to make food taste better. The murmurs grew louder, some beings laughing, others exchanging troubled glances. The younger council member, who had seemed sympathetic earlier, leaned forward even further. Her expression, intent to Quillos, slammed one of his arms against his throne, demanding silence. The classification of the substance is not relevant to these proceedings. The law is clear, and you violated it. The sentence was appropriate under the circumstances. The circumstances, Tay repeated, and there was an edge in his voice now that made several beings in the front rows shift uncomfortably. Let us talk about circumstances. Your classification system says that Zerith 7 is unsurvivable, that nothing can live there for more than a few hours, but I lived there for over a month. I built shelter, I hunted for food, I planted gardens, I cooked meals that your own researcher described as incredible. He gestured toward Nari, who stood at the edge of the chamber. With Sue and the Earth delegation, the Velith researcher straightened under the attention, her expression resolute despite the risk she was taking. I am not special, Tay continued, returning his attention to the council. I am not a superhuman or a genetic experiment or anything else remarkable. I am just a human, member of a species that you consider primitive and dangerous. We evolved on a world that your system classifies as Class 7, moderately dangerous. He smiled slightly, and there was no humor in it. Every day of our existence has been a struggle against predators and weather and disease and each other. We have learned to adapt, to survive, to overcome, and we have learned to cook. He reached into his bag and pulled out his grandmother's recipe book. Holding it up for everyone to see, the small worn notebook looked incongruous in this setting, a simple object among all the technology and grandeur. But the gesture had the effect Tay intended. Every eye in the chamber was fixed on it. This is my grandmother's recipe book. She gave it to me before I left Earth, and I carried it with me to Zerith 7 when I was alone and afraid, when every day felt like it might be my last. I would open this book and read her recipes, and I would remind myself that as long as I could cook, I could survive. He opened the book to a page near the middle, scanning the familiar handwriting that had guided him through so many meals. She taught me that cooking is not about ingredients. It is about understanding, about recognizing the fundamental principles that govern how food transforms when heat is applied, when time is given for flavors to develop, when different elements are combined in ways that enhance each other. He looked up at Quillos, meeting the arbiter's compound eyes without flinching. A recipe is just a map, a guide that shows you where others have gone before. The best cooks are explorers who can find their own paths, who can look at unfamiliar ingredients and see the potential within them. He set the book down on the platform in front of him, treating it with the careful reverence it deserved. My grandmother taught me that you taught me nothing except that the galaxy's justice system is broken, that powerful beings will use their power to crush those who annoy them. Regardless of the actual harm caused, that mercy can be crueler than punishment. The chamber was silent now. A heavy stillness that pressed against the walls. Quillus's arms had stopped their agitated clicking. Frozen in place as the human's words washed over him, the other council members were staring at Tay with expressions that ranged from anger to shame to something that might have been admiration. "What do you want?" Quillos asked finally, his voice flat and controlled. Tay had been waiting for this question. He had thought about it during the long journey back from Zyrith 7. Discussed it with Sue and the diplomats and Nari during late-night strategy sessions on the Shippy knew exactly what he was going to say. "I want you to drop all charges against me," he said. "I want a formal apology from this tribunal, issued publicly and recorded in the official archives. I want compensation for 37 days of wrongful exile, calculated at whatever rate is standard for this kind of injustice." He paused, making sure he had the full attention of everyone in the chamber. "And I want Gachugaru, the substance I was convicted of smuggling, reclassified as a food product rather than a controlled substance. It is chili flakes as seasoning, no different from the hundreds of other spices that are traded freely across the galaxy." Quillos made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a growl. "You dare make demands of this tribunal? You are a convicted criminal. Regardless of your survival, your continued existence does not erase the fact that you broke the law." "I am a survivor," Tay replied, his voice steady, "and I am not alone." He gestured toward the doors of the chamber, and they opened to reveal a crowd of beings from dozens of different species, some of them T recognized from news reports. Faces of activists and journalists and politicians who had spoken out about his case. Others were strangers, ordinary beings who had watched his restaurant review and felt something stir in their hearts. They were holding signs and banners with messages of support, symbols that represented a dozen different cultures united in common cause. "My story has inspired people across the galaxy," they said, turning back to the council. "Beings who never thought about humans before are now asking questions about what we are capable of. Some of them are afraid, I know, but many of them are curious. They want to know more about a species that can turn a death sentence into a cooking show." He took a step closer to the council, his eyes locked on Quillos. "You can fight this. You can insist that I am a criminal and that my survival means nothing. You can try to maintain the illusion that your tribunal is just and fair and worthy of respect, but the galaxy is watching, and they have seen what I can do. They have seen what humans can do, and they will not forget." The chamber erupted in noise, beings shouting and clicking and whistling in a cacophony of reactions. Some were angry, protesting the humans' arrogance and challenging the tribunal. Others were cheering, expressing support for his demands. The media drones zoomed in closer, capturing every expression and gesture for audiences across the stars. Quillos raised his arms for silence, but the noise continued for several long moments before gradually subsiding when he spoke again. His voice was tight with barely controlled fury. "The council will deliberate. We will announce our decision within the standard cycle." Tay nodded, accepting the delay. He had not expected immediate capitulation, and the fact that Quillos was buying time suggested that the outcome was not as certain as the arbiter might have hoped. "That is acceptable," Tay said. "I have learned patience in my time on Zyrith 7. He turned and walked out of the chamber, his head high and his posture confident. The crowd parted to let him pass, and as he went, he heard voices calling out to him, words of encouragement and support in a dozen languages. He nodded acknowledgement but did not stop, moving steadily toward the exit where Sue and Nari and the Earth delegation waited. "That was incredible," Sue said when he reached her, her voice hushed with awe. "I have never seen anyone talk to the tribunal like that." Tay shrugged, a gesture of false modesty that did not fool his sister for a moment. They needed to hear it. Someone had to say what everyone was thinking. Nari stepped forward, her expression thoughtful. "You have changed things, whatever the council decides. The galaxy will not forget what happened here today. Your species has been noticed in a way that cannot be ignored. Is that a good thing?" Voicing the concern that had been nagging at the back of her mind, Nari considered the question carefully. I do not know, but it is significant. Humans have always been seen as newcomers. Primitives who stumbled into space before they were ready after today. That perception will change. Some will see you as threats, others will see you as potential allies, but no one will dismiss you anymore. They walked through the corridors of the tribunal station, past the beings who had gathered to watch the proceedings, past the media drones still capturing footage for their audiences, past the officials and guards and bureaucrats who kept the vast machinery of galactic justice running the atmosphere was charged with energy, the sense that something fundamental had shifted and would never be quite the same again. At the docking bay, where their ship waited, Tay paused and looked back at the station one last time. He thought about the first time he had seen it, chained and helpless, and facing what he thought was certain death. He thought about the tribunal chamber and Quillos, and the sentence that was supposed to break him. He thought about the weeks he had spent on Zerith 7, learning to survive, learning to cook, learning what he was truly capable of when everything was stripped away. Then he turned and boarded the ship, ready for whatever came next. 3 days later, the council announced its decision. The charges against Tay were dropped, declared invalid due to procedural irregularities in the original trial. A formal apology was issued, carefully worded to avoid admitting any actual wrongdoing, but acknowledging that the outcome had been unfortunate. Compensation was awarded, a substantial sum that would allow Tay to live comfortably for years, even by Earth standards, and Guchugaru, along with several other Earth spices that had been previously classified as controlled substances, was officially reclassified as a food product, unrestricted and legal for transport across all sectors. Tay watched the announcement from the observation deck of the Earth's diplomatic vessel, surrounded by Sue and Nari and a small group of supporters who had become friends during the ordeal. The council member reading the decision looked uncomfortable, her words stilted and her posture defensive. But the substance of what she said was everything he had asked for. You did it, Sue said, her voice thick with emotion. You actually did it. Tay shook his head slowly. We did it, all of us. The diplomats who fought for me, the beings who showed up to support me, Nari, who risked everything to help a stranger. None of this would have happened if I had been truly alone. Nari's exoskeleton shifted in what Tay had learned to recognize as embarrassment. I only did what was right. Anyone would have done the same. No, Tay said firmly, most would not have. That is what makes it matter. He looked out at the stars beyond the viewport, the same stars that had watched over him during his exile. He thought about Zerith 7 and the camp he had built there, the shelter and the garden and the smokehouse that had kept him alive. He thought about the meals he had prepared and the techniques he had developed and the recipes that existed nowhere else in the galaxy, and he thought about what came next. I have been thinking, he said slowly, about what I want to do when we return to Earth. Sue looked at him with the knowing expression of a sister who had watched her brother face impossible odds and emerge victorious. Let me guess, a restaurant. Tay smiled, the first genuine smile he had allowed himself since this whole ordeal began. A restaurant, but not just any restaurant, a place where the food tells stories, where every dish carries the memory of survival and adaptation and the stubborn human refusal to give up. He turned to face the others, his expression serious despite the smile. I want to call it Class-9 kitchen. I want to serve dishes that I developed on Zerith 7, using techniques that I learned when my life depended on getting things right. I want people to taste what it means to turn a death sentence into a culinary adventure. Nari stepped forward, her compound eyes bright with interest. I would like to see that. I would like to taste what you create. You'll be welcome anytime, Tay said. First table, any night you want. Sue laughed and wrapped her arm around her brother's shoulders. Only you would come back from a death world with restaurant plans. Most people would just want to rest and recover, maybe write a memoir. Tay shrugged. Cooking is how I rest, how I process things, how I make sense of a universe that tried to kill me and failed. The food I make will tell the story better than any book ever could. The ship began to move, pulling away from the tribunal station and orienting toward the distant point of light that was The journey home would take several days. Time that Tay intended to use planning and preparing for what came next. He had seeds from his garden on Zerith 7. Samples of ingredients that might or might not grow in Earth soil. He had recipes that existed only in his memory and his notes. Techniques that no one else had ever developed hand. He had a story to tell. "One dish at a time, let us go home," he said. "Watching the stars slide past the viewport, I have a lot of cooking to do." Earth looked different from orbit than Tay remembered. He stood at the viewport of the diplomatic vessel and watched his home planet grow larger as they approached. The familiar blue and green and white swirling together in patterns that had been constant for billions of years. The continents were where they had always been. The oceans still covered most of the surface. And somewhere down there were the places he had grown up, the cities he had visited, the people he had known before everything changed, but something had shifted in how he saw it now. Perhaps it was the time he had spent on Zerith 7, surrounded by alien landscapes, and toxic atmospheres and creatures that wanted to kill him. Perhaps it was the perspective that came from standing in a galactic tribunal and demanding justice from beings who had never expected a human to survive long enough to make demands. Earth seemed smaller than he remembered, more precious. A single point of light in an infinite darkness that could so easily be extinguished. Sue found him there, standing in the observation deck with his face pressed close to the viewport like a child seeing something wonderful for the first time. She had been handling the logistics of their return, coordinating with the diplomatic corps and the media and the countless people who wanted to interview her brother. The attention had been overwhelming. A constant flood of requests and demands that had required all of her organizational skills to manage. "We will be landing in Seoul in about 6 hours, she said. "Coming to stand beside him, the reception is going to be intense. There are crowds waiting at the spaceport. Media from every major network. Government officials who want to shake your hand and be photographed with the famous Deathworld survivor." Tay nodded slowly, not taking his eyes from the planet below. "I expected as much. There is also something else." Sue hesitated, and Tay turned to look at her. Recognizing the expression on her face, it was the look she got when she had good news that she was not sure how to deliver. "I have been making calls while you were sleeping and recovering. A lot of calls. Calls about what about your restaurant?" She pulled out her tablet and showed him a screen full of documents and figures. "I reached out to some investors. People who had expressed interest in supporting you after your review went viral. I explained your vision, the concept of Class-9 kitchen, the unique position you are in to create something no one has ever seen before." Tay looked at the numbers on the screen and felt his eyebrows rise. "That is a lot of money. That is enough to open a proper restaurant in Seoul, rent a good location, buy equipment, hire staff, cover operating costs for the first year while you build a customer base." Sue's expression shifted to something more cautious. "If you still want to do this. I mean, I know you said it while we were in the middle of everything. And sometimes people say things in the heat of the moment that they do not really mean." Tay was quiet for a long moment, processing what his sister had done. She had taken his throwaway comment, his half-formed dream, and turned it into something real, something possible. She had worked behind the scenes while he was recovering from his ordeal, building the foundation for a future he had barely dared to imagine. "You did all this for me," he said finally. Sue shrugged, trying to appear casual despite the emotion in her eyes. "You are my brother. You survived a death world by cooking. The least I can do is help you open a restaurant." Tay pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly for a long moment. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of survival and politics and media attention, and he had not had time to properly appreciate what his sister had done for him. She had dropped everything to come save him, risked her career and her safety to secure a place on the retrieval mission. And now she was building him a business from scratch. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt inadequate for what he was feeling. "Thank you for everything," Sue hugged him back, then pulled away with a businesslike expression. "Do not thank me yet. We still have a lot of work to do, finding a location, designing the menu, hiring staff. All the boring administrative stuff that goes into opening a restaurant, but I think we can do it. I think we can make something special." They spent the rest of the journey planning, sketching out ideas on tablets, and arguing about details the way siblings do. Tay wanted the restaurant to be small and intimate. A place where every table felt personal and every meal was an experience. Sue wanted it to be larger, able to accommodate more customers and generate more revenue to pay back the investors. They compromised on a medium-sized space with room to expand if things went well. The menu was easier to agree on. Tay would create dishes using the techniques he had developed on Zyrith 7, adapting Earth ingredients to methods that had been born from necessity and refined through experimentation. Some of the alien ingredients he had brought back might be cultivatable, adding truly unique elements that could not be found anywhere else. He would tell the story of his survival through food, each dish a chapter in the narrative of how he had turned a death sentence into a culinary adventure. They landed in Seoul as the sun was setting, the city lights beginning to twinkle across the landscape like earthbound stars. The crowds at the spaceport were even larger than Sue had predicted. Thousands of people gathered behind barriers, holding signs and cheering and trying to catch a glimpse of the man who had become an unlikely hero. Media drones filled the air, and the flash of cameras created a constant strobing effect that was almost disorienting. Walked down the ramp of the ship and into the chaos, waving to the crowd and smiling for the cameras. His face was everywhere now, on screens and billboards and the sides of buildings. The Deathworld survivor who had become a symbol of human resilience. He had not asked for this fame, had not planned for it, but he was determined to use it for something meaningful. The next few months were a blur of activity. Finding a location took longer than expected. The investors wanted somewhere prominent, a high-traffic area where the restaurant would be visible and accessible, but Tay wanted somewhere with character, a space that had its own story to tell. They finally found a compromise in a converted warehouse in a neighborhood that was gentrifying, close enough to the city center to attract customers, but far enough to have its own distinct identity. The space needed work. Walls had to be moved, a kitchen had to be installed, everything had to be brought up to code and made suitable for public use. Tay threw himself into the renovation with the same energy he had brought to building his camp on Zyrith 7. He learned about construction and plumbing and electrical systems, picking up skills that he had never needed before and finding satisfaction in the physical labor. The design of the restaurant came together piece by piece. He wanted the space to feel like his shelter on Zyrith 7 had felt, rough and natural and alive with the sense of being somewhere unique. The walls were left partially exposed, showing the original brick beneath layers of old paint. Lighting was warm and indirect, creating pools of illumination that made each table feel like its own small world. The kitchen was open, allowing customers to watch the cooking process, to see the transformation of raw ingredients into finished dishes. Nari arrived about 2 months into the renovation, appearing at the door of the construction site with a travel bag over her shoulder and an uncertain expression on her face. She had resigned from her position with the Velith Research Division, she explained, and had decided to see what Earth was like. She had no specific plans, no agenda, just curiosity about the planet that had produced someone like Tay. "You are welcome here," Tay told her, leading her through the half-finished restaurant space. "For as long as you want to stay." Ari looked around at the exposed beams and hanging wires and partially painted walls. "This is going to be your restaurant. This is going to be our restaurant if you are interested." The offer surprised her. She had never considered working in food service, had never thought about cuisine as anything other than fuel for the body, but watching Tay during her weeks of observation had changed something in her, opened her eyes to possibilities she had never imagined. "I do not know how to cook," she admitted. "I do not even know what food I can eat. Most of the things you showed me preparing would probably make me sick." "Then we will figure that out together," Tay smiled, the expression coming more easily now that he was back on familiar ground. "I spent weeks learning to cook with alien ingredients. I can spend a few months learning to cook for an alien." Nari accepted the offer, and her presence brought a new dimension to the project. She could not work in the kitchen, her biology too different from human to share the same food, but she could manage the front of house, greeting customers and handling reservations and providing a visible symbol of the connections Tay had made beyond Earth. The investors loved it. The media loved it, and Nari herself seemed to thrive in the role. Finding purpose in work that was entirely different from anything she had done before, the menu took shape gradually. Each dish going through dozens of iterations before Tae was satisfied. The flagship item was his version of kimchi jjigae. Adapted from his grandmother's recipe, but incorporating techniques he had developed on Xyrath 7, the meat was braised for hours until it fell apart at the touch of a fork. The broth was rich and complex, layers of flavor building on each other in ways that told a story. The fermented vegetables provided that essential sour note, the connection to tradition and memory that made the dish more than just food. The other dishes drew from different parts of his experience: a slow-roasted protein that had been inspired by his hunting and preservation, methods of vegetable preparation that used the smoking techniques he had developed out of necessity, a dessert based on the fruit he had found near the thermal vents, tart and sweet, and unlike anything else on the menu, each dish had a story, and the menu was designed to share those stories with customers. Notes explained the inspiration behind each preparation, the survival situation that had led to its creation, the memory of Earth that Tae had been trying to capture when he first developed the technique. The food was not just food, it was narrative, memory, love, made tangible. The restaurant opened on a cool autumn evening, almost exactly 1 year after Tae had been dropped on Xyrath's 7th line stretched around the block. People who had traveled from all over the country, and some from other parts of the world, to be among the first to eat at Class-9 kitchen inside. The space glowed with warm light. The smell of cooking filled the air with promises of good things to come. Tae stood in his kitchen, surrounded by the staff he had trained and the equipment he had chosen and the ingredients he had sourced from farmers and suppliers across the region. Sue handled the front of house alongside Nari, greeting guests and managing reservations and making sure that everything ran smoothly. She had officially become his business partner, handling the financial and administrative side of things while he focused on the cooking. Her grandmother's recipe book hung on the wall behind the bar, framed and protected, but visible to everyone who entered. A reminder of where this journey had started. The first service was chaotic. As opening nights always are, orders came in faster than they could be prepared. The kitchen staff struggled to coordinate their movements in the unfamiliar space, and at least 3 dishes had to be remade because they did not meet Tae's exacting standards, but they got through it, serving over 100 covers by the time the last customer left. And when the doors finally closed, the staff gathered together to share a meal and celebrate what they had accomplished. To Class-9 kitchen, Sue said, raising a glass of the fermented beverage that Tae had developed from his alien fruit samples. May it survive as long as its namesake tried to kill us. To my grandmother, I added, looking at the framed recipe book on the wall, who taught me that cooking is love made visible to second chances. Nari offered, her voice soft but clear, and the courage to take them. They drank together, the 3 of them who had been brought together by circumstances none of them could have predicted. And for a moment everything was perfect. The restaurant was open, the food was good, and the future stretched out ahead of them, full of possibility. The reviews started coming in the next day, and they were overwhelmingly positive. Critics praised the originality of the menu, the quality of the cooking, the uniqueness of the experience. Food bloggers wrote effusive posts about their meals, complete with photographs that made Tae's dishes look almost as good as they tasted. News outlets ran stories about the Deathworld survivor who had turned his ordeal into culinary art, drawing connections between his survival techniques and his cooking philosophy. Within a month, reservations were booked solid for the next 3 months. Within 3 months, Class-9 kitchen was being mentioned in discussions of the best restaurants in the country. Within a year, food critics from other continents were making pilgrimages to Seoul to experience what everyone was talking about. But for Tae, the real measure of success was not the reviews or the reservations or the awards that started accumulating. It was the faces of the customers when they tasted his food, the expressions of surprise and delight, and sometimes tears as flavors triggered memories and emotions they had not expected. It was the conversations he overheard at tables, people sharing stories about their own survival experiences, their own challenges, their own moments of deciding to keep going when everything seemed impossible. It's the letters he received from people all over the galaxy, beings of dozens of different species who had watched his restaurant review and felt something stir in their hearts. They wrote to tell him that his story had inspired them to try new things, to face their fears, to cook for people they loved. They sent him recipes from their own cultures, dishes that carried the same weight of memory and tradition that his grandmother's food had carried for him. He answered every letter, and sometimes he incorporated their ideas into his menu, special dishes that celebrated other culinary traditions. Prepared with the same care and attention that he gave to everything else, each one was a bridge between worlds. A reminder that food was a universal language that could connect beings regardless of their biology or background. One evening, about 18 months after the restaurant opened, Tay was in the kitchen preparing for service when Nari appeared at the pass with an unusual expression on her face. "There is someone here to see you," she said, "someone you might want to meet personally." Tay wiped his hands on his apron and followed her to the front of the restaurant. Curious about who could have prompted such a reaction, he found a table near the window occupied by a young Velith with soft features and an uncertain posture. She was the council member who had seemed sympathetic during his tribunal appearance, the one who had leaned forward when he spoke, as if she actually wanted to hear what he had to say. "Hope this is not inappropriate," she said when he approached. "I was in the sector on diplomatic business, and I wanted to see your restaurant. For myself, I have heard so much about it." Tay smiled and pulled out a chair across from her. "It is absolutely appropriate. You are welcome here. What would you like to eat?" She looked at the menu with obvious uncertainty. "I do not know what any of this is. My species does not consume food in the same way yours does. But I understand that some of your dishes can be adapted for different biologies. I developed several preparations specifically for non-human visitors." He pointed to a section of the menu that he had created after Nari joined the team. "Its flavors will be different than what humans experience, but the essence of the dish should come through. Tell me what kind of sensory experience you enjoy, and I will create something for you." They talked for a while, Tay asking questions about Velith taste receptors and nutritional requirements, the council member sharing information that helped him understand what might work for her. Then he went back to the kitchen and began to cook, drawing on everything he had learned about alien biology and culinary chemistry to create something unique. The dish he brought out 30 minutes later was like nothing he had made before. A preparation that used thermal techniques to create textures the Velith could appreciate, compounds that would trigger their sensory receptors in ways analogous to how humans experienced flavor. It was experimental, risky, the kind of thing that might fail spectacularly. The council member took a bite and was silent for a long moment. Then she looked up at Tay with something like wonder in her compound eyes. "This is extraordinary. I have never tasted anything like this. How did you know what would work?" Tay shrugged. "I did not know, I guessed. Based on what you told me and what I have learned, cooking is experimentation. You try things and see what happens. You learn to do that on Zerith 7. I learned it from my grandmother. She just taught me the principles. The planet taught me to apply them under pressure." The council member finished her meal and paid her bill and left with promises to return the next time she was on Earth. After she was gone, Tay stood in the dining room looking at the framed recipe book on the wall and thinking about the strange path that had brought him to this moment a lifetime ago. He had been arrested for carrying chili flakes now. He was running a restaurant that served customers from across the galaxy, using skills he had developed in a fight for survival to create experiences that brought people together. His grandmother would have been proud, that thought. More than the reviews or the reservations or the awards was what made everything worth ETH. Returned to the kitchen and began preparing for the evening service. There were customers waiting, dishes to be made, stories to be told, one plate at a time, one meal at a time, one connection at a time. That was how you changed the galaxy, through food and memory and love made visible. Class-9 Kitchen was open for business. 5 years had passed since Tay opened the doors of Class-9 Kitchen, and the restaurant had become something he never could have imagined during those desperate days on Zyrith's 7th original location in Seoul was still operating, still packed every night with customers who traveled from across the planet and sometimes from across the galaxy to taste what everyone was talking about, but it was no longer alone. 3 more Class-9 kitchen restaurants had opened in other cities, each one carrying the same philosophy and the same commitment to quality that Tay had established from the beginning. A cookbook had been published, telling the story of his survival through recipes and photographs and essays that connected each dish to the moment of its creation. A documentary had been made, following his journey from the tribunal to the Deathworld to the kitchen, and it had been viewed by billions. Tay himself had changed as well. The thin, desperate man who had been dropped on Zyrith 7 was gone, replaced by someone more settled, more content, more at peace with who he was and what he had accomplished. He still cooked every day, still spent hours in the kitchen experimenting with new techniques and refining old ones. But the manic energy of survival had given way to something calmer. A sustainable rhythm that would carry him through the years ahead. Tonight was special. The Seoul restaurant had been closed to the public for a private event, the tables rearranged to accommodate a gathering that had been planned for months. Guests were arriving from all over the galaxy, beings who had been part of Tay's journey in one way or another, coming together to celebrate something that none of them had expected. Was the 5th anniversary of the restaurant's opening. And also, by strange coincidence, the anniversary of Tay's original arrest for smuggling chili flake Sue was the first to arrive. As usual, she had become the CEO of the Class-9 Kitchen Corporation, managing the expansion and the licensing and the countless business details that made the enterprise possible. Her life had changed as dramatically as her brother's. From marine biologist to restaurant executive, but she had taken to the role with the same competence she brought to everything. The gray that was starting to appear in her hair only made her look more distinguished. The caterers are set up in the back, she reported, consulting her tablet as she walked through the door. All the special dietary requirements have been accommodated. We have 3 different menu tracks for the various species attending, plus the standard human options. Everything should be ready. Tay looked up from the table he was setting and smiled. Relax, little sister, this is a party, not a business meeting. Parties are business meetings with better food. But she smiled back, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. You are right. I need to learn to let go sometimes. Nari arrived next, accompanied by a small delegation of Velith researchers who had become regular visitors over the years. She had officially become a permanent resident of Earth 2 years ago, finding in this strange world and its strange people something that her home had never offered. Her role at the restaurant had evolved from front-of-house manager to something harder to define. A combination of ambassador and advisor and friend, she was the bridge between worlds. The proof that connection was possible across the vast distances of culture and biology. The Velith Council sends their regards, Nari said, presenting Tay with a small package wrapped in iridescent material and a gift. The new High Arbiter wanted you to know that the reforms you inspired have been implemented across 4 sectors now. Quillos had been removed from his position 3 years after Tay's trial. Brought down by a combination of political pressure and his own overreach, the new leadership was more moderate, more open to reform. And Tay's case had become a catalyst for changes that were still rippling through the galactic justice system. The classification of substances had been revised, the exile process had been reformed, and the rights of accused beings had been strengthened. It was not perfect. Nothing ever was. But it was better. Tay unwrapped the package and found inside a small crystal sculpture, a representation of Zyrith 7, rendered in precise detail. He could see the jungle and the mountains and the thermal vents, even the rock formation where he had built his camp. It was beautiful and strange and surprisingly touching. Tell them thank you, he said, and tell them they are always welcome here. More guests arrived as the evening progressed. Scientists who had studied his survival techniques and incorporated them into emergency protocols. Food critics who had championed his restaurant from the beginning. Politicians and diplomats who had worked behind the scenes to secure his release. Ordinary people who had been inspired by his story and wanted to shake the hand of the man who had shown them what humans were capable of. And then, arriving through the back entrance to avoid the crowd, came a guest that surprised everyone. The young Velith council member who had visited the restaurant years ago was back. But this time, she was not alone. She was accompanied by an entourage. That included several high-ranking officials and what appeared to be a security detail. Their presence suggested that this was not just a social visit. Tay of Earth, she said formally, approaching him with her entourage in tow. I am honored to see you again on behalf of the Galactic Council. I am here to present you with something that has never before been given to a human. She produced a small case and opened it to reveal a medal resting on a bed of dark fabric. The medal was made of a metal Tay did not recognize. Shimmering with colors that shifted as it caught the light, symbols were etched into its surface, patterns that seemed to move when you looked at them directly. This is the citation of extraordinary achievement, the council member explained. It is awarded to beings who have demonstrated exceptional contribution to galactic civilization in recognition of your survival, your advocacy for justice reform, and your work building bridges between species through cuisine. The council has voted unanimously to grant you this honor. You are the first human to receive it. The room had gone silent. Everyone watching as Tay reached out and took the medal from its case. It was heavier than it looked. Substantial in his hand, the colors continued to shift, creating patterns that were mesmerizing to watch. I do not know what to say, he admitted. Finally, say that you will keep cooking, the council member replied, and there was warmth in her voice that transcended the formality of the occasion. The galaxy has learned much from your food. It would be a loss if you ever stopped. Tay looked around the room at all the beings who had gathered to celebrate with him. Species that had never interacted before were standing together, sharing drinks and conversations and the experience of being in this place. He thought about his grandmother and her small kitchen in Seoul, about the lessons she had taught him without ever seeming to teach. He thought about Zyrith 7 and the camp where he had fought to survive. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, to this moment, surrounded by friends and allies from across the stars. I will keep cooking, he promised, for as long as I am able. The formal part of the evening gave way to celebration. Food and drink and laughter filling the restaurant as the guests mingled and shared stories. Tay moved through the crowd, speaking with each person, thanking them for coming and for everything they had done. He heard stories he had never known before, about how his survival had inspired others, about the ripple effects of his actions that had spread far beyond anything he had imagined. Near midnight, when the crowd had thinned and only the closest friends remained, Tay found himself standing alone in front of his grandmother's recipe book. The worn notebook looked the same as it always had, the cover faded and the pages yellow with age, but now it hung in a place of honor where everyone who entered could see it. Sue found him there, as she always seemed to when he needed her. She stood beside him in comfortable silence. Two siblings who had been through more together than most people experienced in a lifetime. What are you thinking about? She asked finally. About Grandma, about what she would say if she could see all this. Sue considered the question. She would say, you are using too much salt. She always said that. Tay laughed, the sound echoing in the empty restaurant. She was never satisfied. She always thought things could be better. That is where you got it from. Sue looked at the recipe book, at the handwriting that had guided so many meals over so many years. She would be proud of you. You know that she would be so proud. They stood together for a while longer, not speaking, just being present in the moment. Then Sue put her arm around her brother's shoulders and squeezed gently. Come on, we should help clean up. The staff cannot do everything. They work together, clearing tables and washing dishes and putting the restaurant back in order. It was mundane work, the kind of thing that happened every night in restaurants all over the world. But there was something satisfying about doing it with his own hands, about being connected to the basic reality of what he did. Even after all the fame and recognition, by the time they finished, the sun was beginning to rise over Seoul. The city was waking up around them, millions of people starting their days, unaware of the celebration that had just ended. A new day was beginning, bringing new challenges and new opportunities.